well?
I think.
Okay.
It's blinking.
They got a little thing up in the corner that says recording when it's blinking?
You got it.
Okay.
Nailed
So
it.
we are officially good to go?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, welcome. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, I'm going to sit back and relax a little.
Me too.
Okay, so where to begin? I figured since we have so many things that we want to talk about, I would just like to get, I guess, a basic backstory of yours, like what you do, why you chose to do it, even like maybe what you studied to bring you there, or those kinds of things. What is your basic story? What brought you to this place?
Yes. So previous to my career change, I got a bachelor in psychology from Mount Royal University, and during the time I was getting that bachelor's and after, I worked in more of like a high risk counseling environment.
Okay.
I wasn't necessarily able to work in like a general counseling position because I didn't get my master's. So I worked in places like the last place I worked was a domestic violence shelter and a homeless shelter. Previous to that, I was working in like home care and that sort of thing. And I noticed that like there was a high turnaround of the same clients over and over and over, and it was interesting to me, and it was also concerning because every time they came in, they had to retell their story. Like they had to do an intake, and they had to say, "This is what happened to me. This is my story. This is what happened to me. This is my story." And because of the high turnaround, like most programs are only like 20 to 30 days. Unless you're lucky enough to get something that is long-term, you're literally retelling your story every single month. You're reaffirming your story every single month. And so at the end of my counseling career, I unfortunately, well, it's kind of fortunate because I got this great career now, got really sick. And I spent probably 2 to 3 years at home just reminiscing on like how I want to go forward in my career. And I considered that talk therapy wasn't necessarily the end all be all to help people. I didn't feel like it empowered them to make any or a lot of change. It was kind of just like, this is my story, I am the victim. This is my story, I am the victim.
Right.
And so I moved into a space of using cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy. Because
Okay.
it actually provides people the tools to attain the change that they want to change, no matter what the story is. So like no matter what the problem is, you can change it. And it ties it together because during that time I was doing a lot of self-study because the reason I had to stay home included a lot of pain. And so I was learning how to manage that pain. And I was trying to do it in a way that, like, it was very interesting. Like, even the hospital, the programs that I was in included things like mindfulness, meditation. And so I just kept going with that further. And I took Zen therapy courses, I took Reiki courses, I took so many, so many courses. And I came to realize that, especially with the Zen therapy course, that cognitive behavioral therapy and the other behavioral therapies and Zen therapy, like the Zen philosophy, were very similar, if not almost the same, in ending suffering. And that is that you are not your thoughts, you are not your emotions, you are not your story. And this is the most important part for me, is that you are not your story. And your story is portrayed through your thoughts and your emotions every day, telling you about every situation that you encounter so that you don't have to relearn things. It's like when you roll up to a stop sign, you don't have to relearn every time what that stop sign means.
Right.
You also don't have to relearn what you expect other people to do when they come to that stop sign. And so I think that's one of the most, like, for me, that was one of the most profound understandings, is that if you can get people to understand the space between themselves and their thoughts and their emotions and the stories that is pushing those, then you can get people to change the narrative that is causing them suffering in the first place.
Right.
But if I look back on my counseling career, I can see that every time someone came in and they had, like, whether they were in like 2 or 3 months ago and they had to come back in, they still had to retell the story of their victimization and their defeat.
Was that just
And
part of the program? Like part of what was
yeah,
required every time you come back, you have to relay again what you went through?
yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In my previous, in the last jobs that I had, there was other ones that there was long-term clients that they were in there for life. But in the domestic violence shelter and in the homeless shelter, there was a high turnaround. Like in the domestic violence shelter, it was only like a 30-day program. And then you're sent off to another program where you have to tell your story again. And then, so like,
Ah,
it's just like a retelling of it, keeps you in the confines of
mm.
it.
So it's really easy for people to identify with their story like that when they're constantly telling it and it becomes their whole life. You go from one place, you tell it, and then you learn about it and you experience the idea of it for those 30 days, and then you move on to somewhere else. Like, so
Yes.
how do these programs work exactly? Like you said that they're only 30-day programs, and that would be at a domestic violence shelter?
Yeah. So I worked on like the very front line. Like as soon as something happened to someone, they called, they needed a place.
Mm-hmm.
If they were accepted, then they were able to come into the program, and then you set them up with like I think it was 28 days, but um, with a program that, like, you meet with a counselor this many times a week, you meet with someone to make plans this many times a week, and you really try and make a sustainable plan to go forward, and then you can
Mm.
go into secondary stage housing. That's
Okay.
particularly for the domestic violence shelter. For the homeless shelter, it was, you come in, and they had kind of I won't name who they are, but they had kind of a weird intake format where you had to be there lined up at 6 a.m. to see if you even would get a spot.
Okay.
Um, so, and then, yeah, if you got an interview, then you had to tell your story, but it wasn't as in depth as the domestic violence shelter.
Mm. So what determined whether or not you got a spot? It was just limitations, like how many they could actually fit?
Yes, and I was a huge advocate for bringing people in most of the time. Like, I was a lot less critical about who could come in. I feel like if you were calling for help, you should get help.
Right.
But that was a challenge for me working there, because I never wanted to say no.
Yeah, of course.
But I worked there for long enough that there was, like, I saw the same client 2 or 3 times, a few of them,
Hmm.
and so on like the third intake, they're retelling their background story plus what had happened in the last 3 months, and it was just really, like, it seemed almost defeating to a
Hmm.
purpose. But I think if you teach someone skills, then you don't necessarily have to have them depend on you for support, because they
Mm.
can eventually depend on themselves for support.
Right. Hmm. Yeah. So that's like the whole ideal behind it, right? Like you teach and you share knowledge, but it's to get them to a point where they no longer need you. Kind of
Yeah.
like the same thing with like parenting, so to speak. You raise your kids so they don't need you anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So you played the counselor role in that situation.
Counselor role, crisis support worker, frontline
Hmm.
worker,
Gotcha.
friend, whatever you wanted to call me.
Hmm. So what made you leave that, or what made you decide you wanted to leave that?
Well, I was forced to, and I was just at home for so long,
Because
just
of your
with it.
sickness.
Yeah,
Mm.
and in that time, that's when I started studying, like, all the consciousness, um, kind of spirituality, Zen therapy, like all the I went like broad spectrum,
Hmm.
and that really changed the game on how I want to be received as like a counselor.
Right. Hmm. Hmm. So what was the next step then? How did you recover from your sickness, and where did it take you after that?
I I recovered through self determination.
Mm.
I had to really take into account how I was dealing with the mindset of being long term, having a long term illness.
Hmm.
I could let it defeat me. I did have the opportunity to stay off work for the rest of my life. They just said, deal with the pain, and that's all you have to do. And
Right.
I don't think that was for me.
Yeah.
It definitely wasn't. So
So
it was,
the illness that you had or have was determined to be a lifetime type thing. And would you mind sharing it, or like just for context so
um,
I can understand a little better? If not, that's
yeah,
okay.
no, they're pretty complicated, but they're inflammatory disorders.
Oh, okay.
Um,
I see what you mean.
yeah, so I still have them, but they are very manageable. I
Mm.
had to change to like an anti-inflammatory diet.
Mm-hmm.
I was given these medications that honestly just made me feel terrible, but with the help of one of our mutual friends, I was able to find different natural herbs
Mm.
and healings to bring me into a space that I was able to manage things and also feel good at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. But the anti-inflammatory diet was a huge game changer. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I was in support groups online, and I was reading things of people saying like, well, I just can't stop drinking like my pop a week. And I was like,
Mm.
if you have an inflammatory, you just can't be doing those things. The willpower, but also like the mindset was the biggest one. Just like being determined that I refuse to be condemned by this illness for the rest of
Yeah.
my life. And so I started slow, and I still feel like I'm going pretty slow because I do still have to take time for my health. But I started putting out there more events, a little bit of personal sessions, but I was getting more into I, sharing how to connect with what I called the higher self.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was also putting in events or out events, sorry, that tried to teach people about like my I want to call it my side passion, but it's getting to be my main passion
Mm.
of our social. I find that our social structure does cause us a lot of suffering. And
Mm.
in my endeavor to end suffering in myself, I found that I had a lot of feelings about how society was structured, and I really needed to talk about it. So
Right. You're going after the root cause.
yeah, so
Yeah.
in 2018 was when I started doing like at the library just once a month, getting people together and let's have a conversation about whatever
Mm-hmm. So
whatever.
so you were working through like for lack of a better term, quote, professional channels. Like you had a counselor job at a homeless shelter and a domestic abuse shelter. And then you got ill. And during that illness, while you were off, that's when you started getting interested in these other subjects and different approaches. So at what point during that time off did you start actually making, like you said, that you organized events and brought people together to talk about these issues? Were you doing like counseling kind of like on your own time? Were you just counseling people you knew? How did it evolve? How did it begin first, but then how did it evolve into something different?
It was it was a little complicated. I'm gonna back up a few years,
Sure.
even like before the counseling jobs. Even
Okay.
when I was at Mount Royal, there was a sociology professor who, in the summer or spring semester, offered a class. It was just a 1 credit class. It was free, and you could go there and you could discuss social issues on a systemic level.
Mm.
And I was so excited to go. I was and it was so cool to see how many people were actually interested. I remember there being like 20 to 30 people there. And like it was 1 credit eventually, but when you initially went there, it was a free class for no credit.
Right.
But so many people attended that the professor was able to actually get us one point, which was
Okay.
great, great. And it really spoke to my heart that other people saw the issues that I saw and wanted to discuss them,
Right.
and found society, like, I don't know the word for it, but found society difficult to digest,
Mm.
on so many levels. And so w- fast forwarding now to when I was recovering, I was trying to figure out how to bring more passion into my life as well as bring the new the new skills that I had been learning into my counseling career. So that's what kind of kickstarted both things. So I think I stayed at home for about 2 years. And then in my third year of recovery, I was doing a lot of things volunteer wise, because I very gratefully had some medical support at that time. So I had some spare time. And really with my illness at that point, I only had like 2 to 3 hours in me at a time before I had to tap out.
Right.
So that was really good for events, because the event only took me 2 to 3 hours and then I was out. And so that's kind of what rolled me into giving presentations on social structure, which I never even thought was possible for, like, who would be interested in that? But people were interested.
Yeah.
And so that's been going on for like just over 2 years now, which is amazing. But the more holistic approach to my counseling was a little slower of a roll into it, because I was not feeling fully confident at that time with where I was at with my illness, presenting on something that might take 5 or 6 hours. It really did. Like 2 to 3 hours never really served it justice. I did give it a few tries, but it didn't give the whole holistic standpoint of what I was trying to get across. So
you mean in like one session, you would ideally go for 5 to 6 hours?
I would do, group sessions.
Oh, okay.
For 5 to 6 hours.
Wow.
Yes.
I'm surprised anybody has the will to go that long with like focusing on changing,
Yeah, some people did. Some people got a little frustrated with it. So I've really been, since that time, molding it to try and fit more what people are comfortable with, instead of me just like I just, at the beginning, I was so excited. I had so much information. I found all this new stuff. I wanted to share it.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Yeah.
Yes.
So then this eventually evolved into an actual business that you started.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
what was that all about? Is that what you refer to as Consciousness Calgary? Consciousness
Calgary is a more recent endeavor.
Okay.
I started with calling myself Higher Self Holistic Health.
like
Very long, but it goes together.
Yeah.
And then I was working with a mentor at the time, and I am super grateful that she wanted to team up. And so she dropped her business name and I dropped my business name, and we came together to create Your Mind's Way.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so she took on the frequency therapies and the couples therapies, and I was the mindset person, the mindset coach. And I flip-flopped between mindset coach and consciousness coach, and I was just really trying to get people, like, the base of my work at that point, and still at this point, is to get people to connect with consciousness, with awareness, with what is behind the thoughts and the emotions and the behavior and the experience and the story. There is that space that we can find that isn't loud, that isn't ego, that isn't defeating. And that's the key, is that part of you can change all those other things if it has the choice to. But if you're unaware of that choice, then it's not going to take you anywhere.
Because it's kind of like running automatically rather than having you have any say as to what it's doing.
Yeah, so I call it the flight of experience.
Okay.
And so when you're flying a plane on autopilot, it'll go reasonably well. But if you want to change the way that autopilot flies, like it's the difference between flying from Calgary to Edmonton for flying and then flying to like somewhere tropical, like Hawaii. You know what I mean? Like
right,
you gotta reroute the system. And to reroute the system, you have to understand how the system was programmed in the first place. And then you have to determine how you want to program it in the future. And like, I think those keys are essential, but those keys are not possible if you're not connecting with consciousness or like true self.
Right.
If you're still like, this is the way I think and there's nothing I can do about it, and this is how I feel and there's nothing I can do about it, that nothing I can do about it negates the process.
Yeah, it just puts a wall between you and that consciousness space.
Yes.
You don't believe that you have the power to change, so you don't even bother.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I really focus my work on connecting people with that space, whether it's having a group conversation about it, or whether it's one-on-one, or whether it's in like a workshop form. Whatever it is, I have skills, I have tools, I have knowledge, and it does. Like, some people honestly get it in a day, and some
Mhm.
people years, and like personally years. And I'm still learning. I'm always learning.
Of course, yeah. Mhm.
But it I, and so Consciousness Calgary is a more recent endeavor in which I have come to terms with, or have realized that, like, I do not have all the answers. I don't.
Mhm.
Nor do I. Like, that's just too much too much
Yeah,
pressure.
of course.
um and there's not even just one way. Like, the way I learned, um, anything that I learned and I present it to other people, is not even close to the same way someone else has learned it and is presenting it. And
Yeah.
so I want to hold space in Calgary and surrounding area for all people who are discussing consciousness on any level, from any perspective, doesn't matter how, to talk about it and to bring their workshops, especially the more grassroots type endeavors, like the wonderful people that are working from home and have amazing material, but they just need a space and they need a little bit more exposure.
Right. So that's part of
So
your work as well, is that helping other people advertise maybe their consciousness-based business or anything in that kind of area. You help them get the word out there. Like you say, you organize events and stuff like that for other people.
yeah, organize, help promote. um, I'm next year, it was supposed to be this year, but we'll see. With
Mhm.
everything going on right now, even get people help in training on how to present. Because I know when
Okay.
I first started to present, like, it was it was scary.
Yeah.
You're standing up in front of a bunch of people and you're just trying to get over the nervousness
Hmm.
of that presentation. So
Yeah.
public speaking skills, professional client engagement skills, those aren't really things that are fully offered, especially in my city, to holistic practitioners. I live in a very
Right.
corporate city. So, like, if you go to something like Toastmasters, you're going to find a fully corporate environment.
What is that?
As
Toastmasters.
Toastmasters is a public speaking um, practice,
Okay. Hmm.
and there's so many in Calgary,
Hmm.
like, so many meetings. And checking them out, I've realized that there is a need for space to learn
Hmm.
in the conscious community. So that's hopefully something I'm going to be moving into within the next year, which will be
Right.
really exciting.
Hmm. So you have the one business with your friend that you that's the your mind's way, and that's
Mhm.
where you do your own like personal counseling and stuff like that. And then Consciousness Calgary is like your promotion and the organizing of events and helping people promote themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
Okay.
got it.
Gotcha. Right. I see.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a good way to segue into what you're doing now with it. And what is your, I guess, goals or desired endpoints for what you are working on?
hmm There is one more component to it.
Mm,
It's called the community. And
mhm.
that is a fully, like, I don't touch on anything with consciousness or um, like mindset, any of that. It is strictly social change discussion.
Right.
And so that's where I get into things. Like, I do have many other presenters coming in because, again, I don't have all the answers, nor do I
Hmm.
want to.
Right.
But I personally have done events on the power structures that we're in, the fear around change, the things that are driving us forward with change. Because I do feel like we are in, like, a conscious evolution right now, or a,
Hmm.
like, revolution, whatever you'd like to call it. It doesn't matter. It's the
Right.
same. We're leveling up.
Yeah. Agreed. I feel like, well, I would say that um, we're always consciously evolving. It's just now we are at that point of really rapid and exponential change.
Yes.
And it's happening so fast now because of that exponential type growth.
Mhm.
Hmm. So, tell me a little bit about your ideals and I guess what you know about the current societal structures and what are the flaws and what are some ways that we can improve them. And when I say a little bit about, I don't mean a little bit about. Go for as long as you want, because I know you have a lot to say on this, and I'm really interested in everything.
I do. Um, so the first two events that I did at
Mm.
the community were, the first one was power dynamics in society, and the second one was social authenticity. And I think those two really go together. I feel like the power dynamics in our society are socially constructed. I've heard arguments that like our natural environment does have those structures within it, and I
Mm.
do agree. But at the same time, we as humans, it has been studied, have the highest capacity in our natural realm to create. And that's the most important, that's like a key point right there. Because if we have that capacity to create, do we actually have to adhere to a hierarchical dynamic? No, we don't. But we do. And that's kind of where it ties into the social authenticity. I don't feel like living in these power dynamical societies and structures actually allows us to come from an authentic space. We put on, I think, a lot of shows. I think we put on a lot of falsehoods that bring us into a space that we are not our true selves. Like, it has been studied many times over in psychology that, you have your true self, and then you have yourself with your family, you have yourself with your friends, you have
Mm.
yourself at work. And especially, it gets so ingrained into our personalities the higher we go in the power structure, or the lower we go, wherever we are in that power structure, it is ingrained in our psyche, basically.
Hmm.
And I think eventually, like, if someone is a big kahuna CEO, they're going to have a way different approach to how they deal with people outside of work than, I want to say, someone that is in like a quote unquote less prestigious job.
Hmm.
Those two kind, like, there is a difference between how the social structures and the power dynamics we have create inauthentic or authentic behavior within people, and I think that really messes us up.
Mm.
In
Most definitely.
truth.
Yeah. Well, we start to believe that those social structures are what is the most real and what matters the most.
Mhm.
Whereas, yeah, they might be necessary in some regard in order to advance us in the system. But when we get attached to those identities and believe that that's who we are, that's where the danger comes in.
Yes. And so in debate, I have been told many times, like, your ideas don't work with how society is. And
Mm.
I'm like, exactly. And they're seeing,
Exactly. Couldn't agree more.
yeah, like, yes. And they're seeing it like, well, it's just completely impossible
Yeah.
because it doesn't fit into the current social structure. But there has been so many evolutions and revolutions throughout history that have been met with such big adversity
Mm.
because people just don't see it working in the
Yeah.
current society. But now, today, like, we wouldn't have the weekend, we wouldn't have the rights that we have, we would still be in like this massively patriarchal society if we didn't put in those fights that seemed
Mhm.
so unrealistic in the moment.
Exactly.
But it's that push that we have to say, like, this doesn't make sense.
Hmm.
And people have been talking about it not making sense for, I mean, I feel like the evolution from the 60s onwards is, in my opinion, an ongoing endeavor. We
Hmm.
are integrating so much more realistic equality, moral and ethical changes than we really ever have before. And we're really at the end of it right now,
Mm.
which is interesting to see, because right now we have generations that were alive when racism and sexism was just the total social norm.
Right.
We have people that were right in the middle where they were part of the shift and they saw the shift. And then we have people now that, like, the generation below me, like, some of that stuff isn't even in their scope. They think like that
Hmm.
is a thing of the past.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So
I
like,
know it gives me hope, honestly, like seeing the younger generation and how against injustice of any kind they are. They don't stand for any type of mistreatment to anyone for any reason. And I'm like, hell yeah, you go, kids. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so that could bring me into the third event that I did for the community. I called the Sane Society, and it was inspired by sociologist Eric Fromm, who wrote a book called The Sane Society.
Okay.
And he makes a point in the first chapter to say that with the mental illness that we have in our society, can we truly say that our society is structured in a sane way?
Mm.
Like with the anxiety and with the depression and with all those things that are prevalent in most people, whether, and this is important, whether realized or not, because it is so normalized to be under that amount of stress
Right.
that having anxiety is a normalized thing.
Yeah.
Like
100%.
like I couldn't even tell you, everyone I know has anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
And it's not necessarily part of a normal, quote unquote, normal social structure.
Mm.
In my opinion, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think suffering is necessary. And I think that can tie back into the power dynamics and the social authenticity that we don't get to experience because we're trying to fit these molds of, like, I have this power and I've got this prestigious job and I've made my millions, but are those people truly happy? It's been proven that no, they have not, or no,
Mhm.
they're not.
Yeah.
Not all, but
100%.
I'm sure there's some.
No, yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's very common. Yeah, and even those who get to the top and they consider themselves happy or fulfilled, they often just are constantly distracted. They go from pleasure to pleasure to pleasure, never really taking time to assess themselves and if they would be okay if all those things were taken away. That's the kind of idea that was kind of ingrained in me when I was a little bit younger. I started to realize that I thought I was happy, but it was because I was constantly surrounded by things that I found enjoyable. And then I was like, well, when these things are taken away or when they're threatened, I feel extreme anxiety because of it. Like if I feel like I'm going to lose a friend or I feel like I'm going to lose something that gives me some sort of self-confidence, then it would terrify me. So I was like, why am I so afraid to lose that? Why can't I live without it? And I don't think that a lot of people in those prestigious type of positions, they don't have those questions because deep down inside, they know the answer is that they would not be as happy or fulfilled as they think they would be. And that terrifies them. So they don't even allow themselves to think about it.
Hmm. Yeah, and identity outside of career, I think, is a really important point in that, because when we identify, and this brings me right back to the point that I realized when I was doing the counseling intakes, is that your identity, that with your career, your identity with your story, your identity with anything, if threatened, are you okay without your story?
Mm-hmm.
And some people are so, and I totally understand, I was there, when you identify with that story so much and that story starts shifting or changing, your whole persona, your whole view of self, your whole view of the world is changing. And then what do you have?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And that's where you can tie it right back into consciousness, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, when you lose all that, um, people have this erroneous belief that when they lose all that identity, all those things they hold on to as themselves, then there'll be nothing. And that seems very scary. But that level of just pure consciousness that we speak of, uh, that, if anything, could be considered your truest form because it is the thing that remains. Even when you let go of, your identity of your career or your persona with your friends or anything like that, if you lost all that, you would still have that consciousness, that awareness that is still there. So if you kind of begin to identify with that, if anything, then that's when you'll be able to assess all the other things in your life from a different perspective, uh, from a certain vantage point that will allow you to be okay with letting go of all those other identities.
Yes. Yeah. And so when I work with people from a conscious perspective, a mindset perspective, I try and teach that you can change any of those things if you wish. If you don't wish, don't worry about it. But having the
Mm,
opportunity to critically look at something and determine whether you want to change it or not without it feeling threatened is a skill.
mhm, most definitely. Hmm. So, um, I'd like to learn a little bit more about all the social structures and stuff like that that you learn about because I don't do a lot of deep research myself. I just take bits and pieces from every talk I listen to or every book I read. I pick up on little bits of information, but I've never, even like in another podcast I did where I spoke to a friend of mine about like communism and socialism and stuff like that. I didn't have a lot of information about the history of them and how they worked, but I just understood the fundamental principles of all that. But since you have done a lot of research in those areas, why don't you tell me a little bit about, I guess, the social structures that we have in place, what they're said to be, what they actually are, and what they could be if we decided to make some changes, and the benefits we could see from those changes.
I hope I can hit all those points.
All right.
Um, so the
Any
social,
one of them would be fine.
perfect. I
But
can hit it from a few angles.
okay.
So currently in Canada, the social structure that we have in place, I don't think is defined correctly.
Okay.
Um, I do see in Canada that we do have a bit of socialism here, even though socialism is a threatening word, because every time socialism has been attempted or done in our history, it has been overtaken by human greed.
Mm,
And I think that's a major point is human greed and communism and socialism. Socialism is supposed to be by the people for the people, but it
right.
never has been.
Hmm.
And so when you hear socialism, it's threatening because you think communism, like those two are very adhered together
Right.
in most people's minds that I've had conversations with. Not everyone. Um, but in Canada, when you hear socialism, it's threatening. But at the same time, like our roads are paved, our hospitals are free, our schools are taken care of up to high school. And those are socialism ideations.
Hmm.
But at the same time, we have capitalist ideations, and then we're in a democracy. And so if you bring all of those together and you take a critical look at them and you see what the issues truly are underlying them, it's always that it's a fear of lack.
Hmm.
Like we fear that we're not going to have enough if we sway a little bit this way or we sway a little bit that way, and we also fear that we don't trust one another.
Hmm. Yeah.
Which is fair because in our government structures there is always some sort of, I want to find the right word for it, there's always some kind of self-fulfilling or greed happening.
Hmm.
And that is happening way on a way bigger scale in other parts of the world, most definitely, but I don't think that should stop us from being critical of what's happening here. And I don't think we should be scared away from growing into a different political system, from growing into a different space that doesn't have those power dynamics that cause people to change themselves.
Hmm.
So when someone enters into a governing system and they get power and they know that and I want to say they're taking care of these people, but then when you're in that kind of position, it's more like you have power over these people.
Mm.
And that we're seeing that big time in Alberta right now. There's a lot of behind the scenes politics happening that, especially around like right now with everything that's happening with COVID, we really want to value our healthcare workers. But Alberta is choosing to make cuts to healthcare during this time.
Mm. Did
But
not know that.
but like what can we personally do about it besides writing letters or like speaking out? Even, the people that are fully for that government are saying like this is wrong. But the changes that we are able to make are very minuscule because the power dynamic that is there. So I know that's kind of changing from the systems we have to
Go ahead.
the problems that I currently see. Like I have a friend who, at the end of this, I don't know if she'll end up living here or not because her wage is getting cut by, I think it's $10 or $11 down.
Just the cut.
Yeah.
Wow. Some people don't even make that.
No, so she's like right on the front line, and she knows as soon as this is over, there's a high chance that her payments are going to be, or her check's going to be a heck of a lot smaller.
Right.
And how is that fair when that is what we are currently relying on?
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard arguments that say like it is fair in other crises around the world that have happened. We've relied on different workers, and it's just their time to bite the bullet right now. But I don't personally digest that very well. And so that's just one example of a power structure that I think is unfair, is immoral. And I think we could move into a social system, a governing system that has a higher moral value. I think that like we can debate all day until we're blue in the face what's good or bad. But we know in our hearts what's moral and immoral.
Right.
And I think that could be a new moral compass for us. Like, I don't feel like anything that we've ever tried before is going to serve us in the future. I used to think, the scary word, socialism. I saw it and I thought, like, this is great. It provides the basic needs for people.
Right.
And I see the opportunities now. Like, I think it was Italy that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but implemented the basic universal income.
Oh, interesting.
And so that's on the table right now for either short term or long term. And then there's other ideas formulating, but all those ideas really revolve around people being able to have food on the table and have a house or a home. And no matter what way we come at that, I want to bring it back to that I don't feel it's necessarily ethical. And I think it is a strain on our mental health as a society to have to work for our basic needs.
Yeah, I would agree.
And so if we didn't have that struggle of working a job that is unfulfilling, like 5 days a week, 8-hour days, that's a long time to spend in something that if you found it defeating, if you even found it only kind of fulfilling, if you didn't find it inspiring, wherever we are, we could evolve into a place that involves, and this is the tricky part, it would involve teamwork and trusting each other.
Yeah.
To bring us into a space that provided basic needs for all. And the tricky part of that is like globalization is a big hot topic right now. And I don't necessarily think that any ideas of globalization that have been presented are going to be exponentially helpful because of where we are with power dynamics and greed and trust and all those things. I don't necessarily think the powers that be currently are going to be helpful in that structure. But I think that we as people are so connected right now in a way that we've never been connected with before. Like, I can put something on social media and the world could see it within a day if it was a good enough idea.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And so with that connection, I think the development of a discussion of support for the world without infringing on without stepping on each other's toes, which is important. Like, I think globalization needs to respect cultural boundaries, cultural differences, all those things, people's space, you know what I mean? Like, those things are important, but at the same time, like, it's a very complicated issue, but it has to be discussed. And that's, I think, where we need to begin. Like nobody, unless they do, I'd love if someone was like, this is the answer, and
Of course,
hammer it
yeah.
all. But
Yeah.
actually opening up to a discussion. I've had discussions recently with people that completely opposite sides of the thought spectrum of me. But at the end of it, we can agree that we have a common enemy, and that's corruption.
Yeah, 100%.
And go ahead.
Well, yeah, that's another thing that just gives me it just, I guess it gives me great hope. Is just that's what I see is like a lot of people will assess these situations and be like, yeah, it's all crazy and it all sucks, but there's nothing you can do when the people on the other side are of that mindset. But more often than not, when you speak to people on the quote other side, you find out that they just want the same thing as you, and they are against the same thing as you. They both want to have enough for themselves and their loved ones, and they are against the corruption of any type of institution that takes advantage of us in any way. And that's kind of like the whole it's like a result of the whole divide and conquer type of strategic implementation. Some certain, I guess, the powers that be, whoever are the higher ups, the highest of the higher ups, they're fully aware of that as a tactic to divide us by making us liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat. That at the end of the day, if you get those people talking, they find out they all want the same things. They just have vastly different ideas about going about it, because we're all operating from a mindset of, like you said, lack and separation, and those types of ideas kind of distort our best ideas when it comes to how to handle it, because we believe certain things about the way it can and can't be, and it very much limits us in the progression of changing those things.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
I also have a question. Like I have a general idea of the answer to this, but just for people who don't know, I guess. When you talk about globalization, you said that there are some suggested ways of going about it, and you said that you don't necessarily trust that those ways are trustworthy. Could you give me some examples of maybe people or institutions or anything of that sort that are suggesting a theory or a way of implementing globalization, and what that truly means and the ways they want to go about it? And if there's, if you know of a better way to go about it, is there a way that we could have globalization in the basic sense of, everybody's operating under the same government, but maybe not government, but you understand what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And that is, I think you kind of hit it on the head at the very end, is operating under the same government, I think, is the dangerous part of this. If we are, for example, the big power players right now are America, China. Those are the only two that are coming to my head right now. And so, Russia.
Sure.
And so if those powers that be, like, they currently do run basically the world's economy, especially, America, with the free trade agreement, for example, in like when they were negotiating the free trade agreement with Mexico, the numbers that I was reading was that they are giving, I can't remember if it's 60 or 70% of their fresh produce to the United States. And so they are only getting 30 to 40% of their fresh produce and importing all these sugary junk foods from the USA. And so it's really messing with the health of the people there,
right?
Because of the power that, like, the big kahuna right now is saying, well, if you want to be in this free trade agreement, this is the agreement, and that's where the money is, and that's where the problem is.
Yeah.
So if we're letting, like, when we're talking about globalization, it would be the bigger players who would be the front runners for this. And I already see so many ethical red flags with those things that I don't feel like giving them a bigger stage to say, like, yeah, sure, fix the world is going to necessarily make the positive change that we need to see. I think it has to come from the smaller guy.
Yeah.
Definitely the smaller
All
guy.
the smaller guys together.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't necessarily trust most current, and that's just me personally, and I know it might sound a little off, but I don't personally trust most bigger governments
Hmm.
to make the ethical decisions to formulate a globalized economy.
Hmm.
I don't think that the one we have right now is fair, and if I think about it, like, in kindergarten, you don't pass if you don't share. But
Hmm.
then past past kindergarten, it's like
Yeah.
the whole thing's out the window.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, what was the second part to your question? Sorry.
Mm, well, I asked about, I guess what is the definition of globalization?
Oh, okay.
Is it
So
just
go.
that we
Yes.
are all under the same government and one institution governs it all?
Yeah. It could be like that. But
Hmm.
I think it could be in a more helpful way, a way that we have agreed upon and fully discussed as a society, like as a global society, without breaking down the already existing societies and cultures that we have within us. Like we don't necessarily need to meld the whole thing together. We
Hmm.
don't necessarily need to be all under the same rules, but we do have to learn to get along and we do have to learn to share.
Hmm.
And I think what would be more helpful than being under one government is being under one agreement. And
Mm,
I think that agreement could align with morals and ethics instead of like, well, you give me this and I'll give you that.
right.
You know what I mean? Like, and it could start even with just determining that, like, okay, we want to honor the lungs of the world, like the Amazon rainforest. Like, let's figure out how we can make that sustainable. How can we support you supporting? Like, there's protests in the Amazon where farmers are burning parts of the Amazon because they're saying we want a cut of capitalism.
Right.
And so, how can we negate? We can say, okay, we hear you. What are you lacking? We'll fill it. And I think that's a discussion we're currently not ready to have, because we're not even ready to have the underlying discussions of, like, if they're not giving equal parts in our minds, then why would we give them anything?
Hmm.
And I've heard that over and over in discussions, but there's just something in me that keeps wanting to have these conversations, because I don't think that like, it brings it right back to the power dynamics. Like, I don't think we need to assert power over one another in any way. I think we need to figure out how to honor one another and how to support one another.
Right.
And that's a completely different ballpark. Like, we we haven't evolved, but we're evolving.
Hmm. Yeah, we haven't evolved to the point yet where we are completely aware of what's best for us.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. So even opening up those conversations, and Facebook has so many negative components to it, but it also has so many positive components. Like, I am in groups on Facebook where we can have these discussions worldwide. They're not quite, in my opinion, big enough yet to make the sustainable change, but the conversations are started.
Mm,
So, like, where I'm moving with my work in the community is opening up discussions about capitalism.
hmm.
So, there was supposed to be one that was the most, like, my highest. I don't want to say highest attended because it didn't actually go down, but the people that were RSVPing and actually saying, like, I will be there, sending me messages, was high. Like, people are ready to discuss that. Like, we are at the end game of capitalism,
Right.
and we need to figure out something more sustainable.
Yeah.
I held one previous to this called Beyond Capitalism. And then I held one right after that talking about the fears and the changes of making these shifts. And I noticed a lot of stagnation in people had all these great ideas, but they were afraid to share them, or they didn't feel like it was the full solution. So they didn't really want to bring it out. But I think if you really bring together all the small little pieces that everybody is doing and everybody is thinking, eventually you can build a bigger picture. But it's the component of listening to each other and actually opening up that conversation and being ready and willing to change,
Mm,
which is right now the part that we need to deal with.
mm. I feel like that's a way bigger possibility right now, because before the COVID pandemic, everybody was maybe not happy living their lives, but they were content. They were pacified sufficiently to the point where they like, oh, well, I don't want to risk this. I have a good thing going. I got a house, I got a job, I got a career, whatever it is. So they're not willing to take big risks and make changes. But whereas now everybody's in a different position, everybody's starting to get used to the idea that everything could change. Now, this is when we had to implant that idea that everything could change for the better.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's really why I want to talk about it. You know what I mean? Like it's an opportunity right now. And it's a difficult opportunity because there's people dying. There's people dying because we don't have the social structures to support ourselves in this kind of pandemic. Like the protests to restart the economy right now are basically a debate of how many people are we willing to sacrifice to restart this economy. And that to me is just, again, like a moral and ethical red flag. Like I know that's immoral. Most people would know that's immoral. But at the same time, it's a conversation we're having because we see the economy as our social norm. And if we don't have that norm, then how will we support each other?
Yeah, exactly.
The lack comes in.
Yeah, I think that mentality, like, even though from our perspective, we can see the immorality of it, from the perspective of the people that are protesting for it, they think they're thinking in the long term, you know, like, yeah, okay, there's people dying, but if we don't get this economy back up and running, then there's going to be a lot worse things in the future because they are still, I guess, attached to the idea of the way their economy ran before. They think that's still the best way to do it, even though it has a lot of flaws. Everybody realizes there's flaws in the way we run the world, but most people don't see ways in which we could do it better. So they will rant and rave about how we need to get things going again, because otherwise, if we don't, a few years down the road or just a few months down the road, it could be a lot worse. But like we've said before, the best way to go about this is not to go back to the way we were before, because the way we were before was not helping everyone. It was not keeping everyone in mind when making certain decisions. So how do we move towards this more ethical and moral economy or societal structure that we envision?
Yeah. And that's where I think having these conversations and being willing to change comes in. I think some people, like, they can't, I've had so many conversations where the idea of a society without money just doesn't, like, it's like a hard no. And like, we could tie this into Star Trek a little bit. So, because like for myself, like growing up watching Next Generation Star Trek and seeing like, okay, if like all, you know, Captain Picard has given so many awesome speeches about like how society used to be and how society is now. And it just seems like so illogical to him to even like, we don't work to provide our basic needs anymore. We work for the betterment of humanity. We work for the prestige of ourselves. Like I see that for us in the future, that once we get to a point, no matter how we get to that point, that part is the part we can discuss right now. But however we get to the point of providing everyone with their basic needs will move us forward into a space of allowing people to work, to grow, to better themselves, to enhance humanity. And I've been in debates where like I see other people's points, but like, let's take a Walmart greeter, for example. I would argue that person has so much more in them than saying, hi, welcome to Walmart.
Yeah.
But I've heard so many arguments of like, you can't take that job away from people because that's the quote unquote only job that they can get based on the stipulations that person sees.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you think back in the day, like the person that was driving the horse and carriage when the car came out, like it could have been the same argument. Like, well, what's going to happen to their job? Something's going to get better. But the change is the scary part. And I feel that change so hard in Alberta because we are the oil and gas portion of Canada.
Yeah.
So, people, I'm from Fort McMurray. So like I have these conversations because, I know lots of people in that industry.
Of
And
course.
even though they see the problems with it, they don't necessarily want change because it's their livelihood.
Yeah.
And we have the whole Wexit movement. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's like there's people in Alberta that want to separate.
Right.
I mean,
Where's the W come from?
Yeah,
West.
we exit, West
Oh, okay.
exit. I don't.
Okay.
I haven't looked into it that in depth.
Right. Yeah.
I have, but yeah.
But the movement that movement itself was that started around election time of last year.
Yes, and so it is basically saying like we in Alberta have given so much money to the rest of Canada that like we feel like we're being treated unfairly when we're basically running the Canadian economy.
Right.
And I think it would be super valuable to consider that instead of saying like, screw it, we're out.
Yeah.
We can say like, look, we've given this much money to the economy. We want support in job transitions. And that's starting to happen now. But I think that it could be like the Wexit people are, I'll give them this. They're so organized. Like they are putting their own money into conferences, like side of the road advertisements. Like they are out there. And if they were demanding change and and this is the key part, if they were okay with moving more into a different economy, instead of saying like, these are our jobs and we want to keep them, which I'm sure not all of them are, but I have ventured into their Facebook groups. I like to know what's going on. And so I think the demand for change could be a constructive one, but then it's the fear of change that really stops people from even demanding it or asking for it.
Yeah.
Like I know people are saying like, we understand the economy needs to change, but I need this job for the next 30 years to sustain my family. I don't have anything else.
Yeah.
Like what would Fort McMurray be without the oil and gas industry?
What is it that they believe they're being treated unfairly about? What is the downside to their situation?
I have seen so many different reasons. I couldn't even summarize. But to think on how to word this, because I'm not necessarily spending, like I'm not necessarily of that mindset. So I don't fully want to speak for them, but you can see on like, if you just go on Facebook and type in Wexit, you can go take a look at all their reasoning, and it is like they're angry and they're upset, and it's because their livelihoods are being threatened.
Right.
And whatever capacity they want to express that has been different.
Right. So is it that are their wages being cut? Are they laying people off? Is it because like this is one thing I've seen from some of the people on my Facebook that are living in Alberta? They'll post memes or whatever about how we get a lot of our oil from Saudi Arabia. Like, why aren't we using Canadian oil type thing?
Yeah. And yes to all those things. I've heard all those things as well. And that is an important part to consider. Like Saudi Arabian oil is cheaper. And it is cheaper because of the environmental standards that Saudi Arabia has implemented versus what we have implemented. And so an alleviation of those environmental standards to a certain extent is being demanded. Layoffs definitely are happening. And this is the second economic crisis in the oil and gas industry that I've lived in. And it's stressful for people because you don't know who's going to be laid off. You don't know who's going to keep their job. And then there's going to be a surplus of workers. And I think that's where the demand to say like, look, we have given so much money to the federal government, to the rest of Alberta, like the equalization payments that like I've looked into them. I couldn't give you a number off the top of my head, but yes, like they are large. And so demanding the change in the economy versus demanding that things stay the same and the regulations get lighter, I think is important. But like I do feel like there is like if you want to support like Canadian oil, then I don't, and you want to support Canadian jobs, then yeah, why are we buying oil from other places? It is cheaper. I see that. I understand that. But that's a problem, I think, in capitalism and the economy, is that we don't necessarily have to or should go for the cheaper.
Mm.
I think we should go for what will sustain us. And this has proven to be problematic time and time and time again. Because when we go for the cheaper option, we don't necessarily go for the best option. It's the difference between buying something from a locally made place and buying something from the dollar store. Like what's going to last longer? Something that someone put time into to make, or something that was mass produced with cheaper quality.
Right.
Like a good example of this is kind of going this way, sidetracking.
All right.
But a good example of this is Amazon has been shown to, if you, mom and pop store, put something on Amazon and it's selling well, Amazon will notice it. They will outsource finding a cheaper version of it, and they will put it aside your item so that people will always click on the cheaper one.
Yeah.
And then eventually it will phase you out of the situation.
Yeah.
And so I think, if you look at a lot of these economic problems, it is because we have gotten to the point in capitalism that we have undervalued labor so much, and we've inflated the need for the cheapest item, the quickest, that like it can't sustain anymore. And when it bursts, what's going to happen?
Yeah. That reminds me of like the whole idea of we can't grow our way out of this, because our economy has always been about growth, just bigger and better and more all the time. And that will reach a point where basically the bubble pops, because the bubble can only sustain so much growth before it loses structural integrity.
Yeah.
I feel like we're getting close to that pop right now, or if not, we haven't already popped, because our economy is not in a good place right now, and everything's changing. And but I definitely see how this could be a turnaround for us. This could be a path in an entirely new direction, because everything just it's all. I don't know. I kind of lost my thought there. What were you going to say?
Yeah, sustainability over growth, I think, could be the new norm. I mean, we can grow and then we pop. And then if we're not ready to sustain ourselves, then, I think the logical way to do this is to deal with the pop before it happens. But like you said, like the pop has, I think, occurred, or at least there's been like pin pricks in it. It's deflating.
Yeah, exactly.
And so moving into sustainability is difficult, because that again requires trust, and it requires people's willingness to work together, and it requires a revamping of the agreements that we have in how we trade resources in the world. And that's totally different than anything we've ever, in my research, have ever seen before.
This idea of moving towards this, I guess, as we've talked before, towards a resource-based economy where money isn't necessarily even necessary. That, like you said before, like that could be our ideal. And what kind of keeps us from going there is that the people in general want a clear-cut path before they even take the first step. They want to see every single step to there before they even take one step, because that's where the fear comes in. That's where it keeps us back from actually progressing, rather than having the mindset that I'm not accepting anything less. And I think that's the kind of mindset we all kind of like need to adapt, is that our ideal, like you said, should be to take care of everyone. Everyone should be provided for in their basic needs. That should be our number one goal. And so the people who are professing that and saying this is where we need to go, they're being expected to lay out the map exactly the way it needs to go. And this is step-by-step process. And if the people who aren't professing it see our map and say, yeah, but look here on this part of the map, you could fall off this cliff or something like that. So they'll scrap the map entirely and be like, okay, no, we're going to keep going the way we're going because your way doesn't work. So that's, I guess, where that kind of leaves us in a state where we need to have faith, we need to have trust, we need to have that determination that we know we can get to a point where all of our basic needs are met. And like fundamentally, there isn't anything truly keeping us from that. There's not this actual lack. It's just the systems in place kind of perpetuate this sense of lack.
Yeah. And there's right now, like, I think it's proving right now that there is like lack is kind of a fiction, because
Mm.
we're seeing, like, for example, like dairy farmers in Alberta are posting videos, and I should fact check this, but posting videos of themselves dumping milk out, basically
Okay.
saying like people aren't purchasing it right now.
Right.
So like in my mind, like, okay, if people aren't purchasing it with money, is dumping it out really the way to go?
Yeah.
Is having a surplus of these different things,
Hmm.
even though like we're not selling them, really the way to go?
Hmm.
And I think, like, to kind of tie it together is the point that we're at right now is, are we willing to have this conversation?
Hmm.
And then if we choose a few solutions and we are trying them, are we willing to not jump down each other's throats? If they start not working, are we willing to work towards different solutions?
Hmm.
And it the tricky part is, are we willing to trust each other to make those changes happen?
Hmm.
And the main counter argument I hear for this is, there are people who aren't necessarily going to help.
Yeah.
And a friend told me once, like, that is a good point. If you think about an ant colony, I think he said like 30% of the ants are a surplus. They don't do anything.
Right.
And they're there for if things start to fail, or if people aren't able to sort things out, or if other people have to dip out, other ants have to dip out. And so I think that is what, like, there is really no shame in, yeah, maybe some people won't want to help.
Mm.
So what?
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah.
Like, I will still do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know most people still will. And
Hmm.
maybe those people, whatever their reasons are, generally, this is my personal opinion, I think that they're just going to need a break.
Hmm.
Maybe they just don't have the cognitive space at that time to put in the work, but maybe
Yeah.
after, like, I can personally attest, being at home for that long doing nothing, like, eventually you're like, I need to do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that will kick in, but some people truly do deserve a break. And I don't think
Of
that's
course.
anything to be ashamed of. And some people just really are so pissed off that they don't want to help. And that also warrants a break,
Yeah,
in my
exactly.
opinion.
I agree. Yeah, I know. I've had the same conversation with a lot of people about how they're like, yeah, but I don't want to. I don't want to go to work and put my hard-earned time in so somebody else can live off my hard work. And I get where they're coming from, but I guess just speaking from my own personal space now, I am I'm at a point where I'm willing to do whatever it takes to move us to our goal. Um, and regardless if people help me on that, it doesn't matter to me. Like I can't feel fulfilled knowing there's this big issue that I was born into, and I'm just going to go with it and just say, yeah, it's just the way it is. There's nothing I can do to change it, when I know what it actually takes to change it. And that's changing myself and doing my best for myself. And if somebody else wants to live off my coattails, is that the right way to say that? I don't know. I can't remember, but you know what I mean? Like my hard earned, my hard work, if I do a lot of hard work and somebody else is living for free off it and they don't have to do anything, then that's not going to bother me. Because I don't, I wouldn't envy that. I wouldn't envy that kind of person that is just living off someone else and being like, yeah, I get to do whatever I want. And everyone else takes care of me and I don't have to do a thing, because that kind of mentality doesn't come from like a stable consciousness. That type of mentality still comes from a sense of separation. Like, yeah, I get all I want and everyone else can, they can do my work for me. It comes from a place where they try to value themselves as higher than someone else because they don't have that sense of inherent value. So to me, if somebody was in that position where they were just taking advantage of everybody else's work, I wouldn't admonish them for that. I wouldn't condemn them for that. I want to get to know them. I'd want to understand why they're there. Like, why don't you want to help everybody else? What is it in you? Why don't you have love and reverence and appreciation for the other people in this world? Why do you feel as if you can take advantage of them and not care about anybody else? Because truly, when you are in the state of mind that you don't care about anybody else, fundamentally, as much as you might want to tell yourself, you don't care about yourself either. There's a sense of lack there. There's a sense of inadequacy. So that's why you will take advantage of others and not care about their feelings, because you don't understand a certain aspect of yourself in that you are part of everyone else. And that kind of mentality, that's the kind of thing that needs to be addressed. It's not just a matter of changing the social systems. We have to change our consciousness as well. It's all connected. It's all part of it.
Yeah. And you know what, that ties into my work with Your Mind's Way and with Consciousness Calgary, like, especially with Your Mind's Way, like really getting people to the root of, like, I want to, when I'm connecting someone with consciousness, I want to give them the understanding of, like, okay, if I have this thought and I can singularly grab that thought and follow it back to the core belief or to the moments in my life that have caused me to think that thought in the first place, I have the opportunity to change. And it really gives you like a whole, I call it the roadmap to the mindset. You know what I mean? Like, you can follow your core beliefs to events, and you can really, and the interesting part of this is when you follow your thoughts and your emotions and your beliefs to events, every event is viewed by a person in a different way. Like 2, 3, 4, however many people can view the same situation in completely different ways and have completely different memories of them. And those memories will build on the information that you already have. So our first core beliefs come into our existence like before we're 8 years old. And then that's like the bedrock of our learning. And at that age, and maybe at like it I don't even want to say at any age, because some people, like, where would you learn this? Right? But like, at what point do you learn, like, okay, every belief that I've ever ingrained could or could not be true? And then, so if you're building off of beliefs that you've gained when you're 8 years old, and you can, it's been studied by many different psychologists over the years, to show like the developmental stages of life. And every developmental stage, you're learning and integrating new beliefs. I call them aha moments. Like, most people know that moment when they first realize that other people aren't fully what they thought they were. And then they shift their perception, they shift their expectation, or they realize like society wasn't what I thought it was, because of certain moments in their life, but not necessarily because those moments were true, but it's because those moments held value for them in the sense that it challenged their belief system. And it said, like, what you believe, this proves otherwise, switch it up.
Yeah.
But without those aha moments, you just continually subconsciously build on the learnings that you already have. And that could prove to be problematic. Like, we all know 1 or 2 grandmas or grandpas that, they're grouchy, this is the way it is, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's just the way they are. That's just the way they think. But the way you think, no matter what age it is, the way you feel, the way you engage with the world, the way you view the world is completely malleable if you'd like it to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I find that that structure of belief that, like you said, it develops like a confirmation bias. When you learn something when you're 5, 6, 7 years old, and it's true to you because you got it from a source that you trust, a source that you admire, a source that you revere in some way. They, like, say, if you had a parent in your life or a role model that has always been honest with you, you're going to take everything they say as gospel. It's just going to be ingrained as the truth in you. But when you get, like, for most people, when they get into their teen years, they start to question those things. And when they question it, it's common for people to just go in the complete opposite direction. Like, okay, well, my mom lied to me, so everything my mom said is now a lie. And they will rebel completely and go in the opposite direction. And that's why you see teenagers going to such high states of rebellion. But then they have a few years of rebellion, and they basically let go of everything they were taught from their parents or their role models because they no longer trust them, and they go in the complete opposite direction. But in going in the complete opposite direction, they're forgetting some of the fundamental values that were representative of truth. And then they end up in a way worse state because they dismissed it all rather than carrying what they believed. They didn't really assess what beliefs were ingrained in them were true and what were just false on some level. So they just end up going the other direction. They end up feeling terrible because of it. Like, just to give a most basic example, parents always tell you, you don't drink, don't do drugs. And then when you find out your parents lied to you about everything, then you're going to drink and do drugs all the time. And then you're going to feel terrible because of that. And then eventually you're just going to come back to the other end of the spectrum. You're going to be like, well, it sucked to do all that. I hurt a lot and I suffered a lot because of it. So maybe my mom was right. And then you'll start to kind of confirm to yourself again that maybe what she said could be right from a certain perspective. And then you adopt those perspectives again. And then you're right back in the whole mindset of what your role model ingrained in you, never really assessing each individual belief on its own. Rather than assessing every individual belief, you just either take everything your parents said or your role model said, or you dismiss it all. And that's where a lot of people make that mistake, is that they'll choose one or the other. And by choosing one or the other, they're either on one opposite end of the spectrum where they dismiss everything, or they fully believe in everything they've been told. And I've seen that myself. Like, when I was a teenager, everybody started questioning everything we've been told. And it was such a glorious time for me. Like, I remember loving that period, because everybody I knew was just always like, yeah, maybe that's not true either. I wonder what this means. I wonder if that was true. And there was always constant discussion on the go. And then we get into adult life and into the career world. And then in order to succeed in that world, we needed to adapt back to our original programming. And then everyone just goes back to their original programming and like, yeah, my parents were right, or yeah, society was right, and I was just a stupid teenager. And then they dismiss everything they thought when they were a teenager. And then they become part of the system as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it just creates this vicious cycle of, people just perpetuating the system without ever actually critically analyzing it.
Yeah. And as soon as we move into the work world, it's like competition. Yeah. And it kind of ingrains that in us so much that, like, now having the conversation of like actually getting along and actually sharing, and those things just seem so far out there that it doesn't even seem possible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, the system is situated in a way that doesn't encourage sharing, doesn't allow for sharing, really.
Yeah.
Doesn't allow for surplus and gifting and stuff like that. It trains you to hoard, trains you to, look after yourself by storing away as much as you can so that you can take care of you and your own. And then everybody else, you'll try to help others, but as long as you're taking care of you, your own, that's all that really matters to you. Because we have this, it's this innate instinct of preservation that's ingrained within us because of our evolution. And of course it's necessary, but like you said earlier, with that level of consciousness we now have, we can kind of transcend above our natural instincts. I remember you saying earlier that a lot of people will say, that's all these characteristics that are inherent in our system. Their defense for them is like, yeah, it's in every natural system. Animals do this. Every bacteria does this. It's how nature works. But that doesn't mean that we can't transcend above those patterns. Like, just for one, like a lot of animals in nature will eat their own young, and they'll rape other animals in their community or whatever. Like, it's very common for those things to happen. So if we took our sense of morality from nature all the time, then we would be okay with eating our own young and raping just for the hell of it. So obviously we've transcended above those patterns, like obviously there are people still who do that, but we as a society have agreed that those are not moral behaviors, and we're doing our best to move away from them and to avoid them. So we can take that kind of mentality that just because we were naturally ingrained to do these things before as a result of our instinctual survival mechanism, we can understand how that came to be. We can understand that we developed that mechanism and that instinct because of the situation we're in. But we as conscious beings have developed a new system where we can choose now to continue those patterns or develop new ones. So that's what we can do as conscious beings. That's what we can do as self-aware beings, ones that are capable of asking questions, whereas animals don't really ask questions. They just see things and act on instinct in a sense. So they don't have the critical thought to analyze a source of instinct, whereas we do. And we like, I wonder why I feel that. I wonder why I want to kill. I wonder why I'm scared, and by questioning those things, we can get to the root cause and then transcend it and then make different choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it's that criticalness that is like a new skill that I think is coming up and quickly. Like consciousness is a buzzword right now. And I've been asked so many times, like, what does consciousness means? And I really think the answer is different depending on where the person is in their life. Like I know when I first started studying consciousness, it was simply, I am not my thoughts, I am not my emotions. And it's taken me on a whole ride since then. But even starting that conversation with yourself and allowing yourself the space, especially in your ego space, to say like, you know what, I have these thoughts and this is the way I see the world, but I understand that is because of my past socialization. Like even like if you want to move away from consciousness and get into the psychology of it, it has been studied that your subconscious mind takes in so much more than your conscious mind. Yeah. And your conscious mind will only show you what you are already looking for. Right. So there is so much stuff that we're missing because we have been socialized in a certain way, but it's not to say that that stuff isn't happening.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember learning that when I was a little kid, and it absolutely blew my mind. I can remember, I don't know, it's probably in grade school, maybe in middle school, where you learn that your brain, and I don't remember the number, but I'm going to throw one out there. Your brain takes in 20,000 bits of information in every second, but we only process and become aware of like 100 bits of information. Now, I don't know what the numbers are, but the difference, the ratio is enormous.
Yeah.
And when you practice a higher state of consciousness, you can increase that number. And it can get to a point where it's overwhelming and you literally can't process everything all at once because your brain is not used to it. Your consciousness is not used to it. So it becomes overwhelming. And that's when, if you don't have basically a control mechanism, a way to understand it, if you aren't practiced in that area, then when you do go to a higher state of consciousness, it can be very fearful. And that's what kind of keeps people from going there. They're like, yeah, I meditated once, but then I started thinking all these crazy things and I didn't like it. So it wasn't working for me. I didn't like meditation. It's not for me. And to that, I would be like, yeah, it means you just need to meditate more. I remember a friend of mine a couple of years ago said that she didn't like weed. And it was just like, I think too much on weed and it stresses me out. And at the time I was half joking, but I kind of meant it as well. It's just like, I know this is going to sound crazy, but what you need to do is get even higher. You just need to keep going. The answers will be there. But, it doesn't necessarily have to come from a psychoactive substance. It can be, that's something I learned from my own internal evaluation, is that these higher states of consciousness that we get from psychedelics or psychoactive substances, that is fully possible within our being at all times. Whether it be from meditation or from breath work or from exercise or from yoga, there's all kinds of methods that we could use to heighten and elevate our consciousness to a level where we understand more and process more.
Yes. Yeah. And that, that's exactly, to tie it back into Consciousness Calgary, that's exactly the point. Like there's so many ways that you can connect with consciousness in so many different aspects from so many different teachers that like there needs to be space for that.
Hmm. Yeah. Mm. So with this elevated state of being that we can all kind of move towards, it's kind of inevitable that we end up moving towards a more moral and ethical society. Like, from my point of view, anyways, that's the way it seems to me. Because once I understood these things in myself, it just seemed obvious to me that we should have a global community. And now, I don't mean it to be governed by one institution. If anything, it would be like centralized government throughout, like it's kind of like the way it is now, but just done properly. Like, every province, every city will have their own government, but it won't be necessarily run by an elected representative. It'll be a committee, a group of the greatest thinkers, the most educated scientists, the most educated philosophers, the most educated spiritualists, and everything will be open for discussion. Everybody's allowed to view or participate in the discussions in which we govern our own community. It's not like you won't be allowed to attend a meeting where all the people in the committee are deciding what to do with you. You will be allowed to understand those things and see their motives. That way, if you're in the committee, you're in the meeting with this committee and they're like, okay, so we need to do this for the people, and it doesn't make sense to you, then you can raise your hand and say, hey, I don't understand why you would want to do that for the community. Wouldn't it just make things worse? And then you could have a discussion and either come to realize that that person was right, or you could educate them on what they're not seeing. And then you could come to a conclusion and come to a compromise, because ultimately the truth is always going to be the truth. Our opinions don't matter in these situations. What's true is that we're all one. It's not just a buzz sentence. Like it's not just something that is fantastical and just nice to say. It is a fact that we are all the one energy expressing itself in an infinity of different ways. So, and we all affect each other. There's nothing that doesn't affect anything else. Everything that exists has some effect on other things. It has some effect on everything, because your frequency or your wave format or your wave signature permeates throughout all of the universe. And even if it doesn't have a big effect on other things, it has some effect. It's changing everything. It's like an ocean. Like one point in the ocean develops a wave, even though you might not be able to measure on the other side of the ocean the way in which that one wave affected that wave, but they're all affecting each other. It's all an integrated system that is co-affecting. There's not one thing that affects one thing and then doesn't have effect on other things. We're all affecting everything at once.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really important point, especially when we're talking about moving into a more of a global, like a global structure, because like right now we have fully accepted, for example, war as a social norm.
Yeah.
And I've really dove into like, why do we do that? Because to me, it doesn't, like, there's been wars. I can't remember a time when there wasn't a war. And it is accepted by me because I see a normative amount of violence that is socially accepted and even like revered in our society.
Yeah.
And I think that like violence, like for example, like I know people that just love boxing. And like maybe you want to hit each other and everyone in it is okay with it. But in war, it's a completely different ballpark. Like we have normalized kicking each other's asses for so long and just taking each other's stuff, that at the end of the day, like for example, like in Canada, I hear a lot of back and forth between like, okay, we need to give Indigenous people's lands back. Okay, no, we don't. Okay, yes, we do. Okay, no, we don't. And the conversation that I hear, like the biggest counter argument that I get is, in history, this is normal. This has happened over and over and over. Why do we have to be the ones to make it right? And I think that's an important point, is that yes, in history, over and over and over, it has happened. But the Albert Einstein quote of like, you do the same thing over and over and over and expect different results is the definition of insanity.
Mm-hmm.
That proves true in this. We can't continue to fight each other for resources, land, space, freedoms. What are my rights and freedoms doing all the way over there? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't see I just don't see the logical or moral implications of this at this point. I have heard many well-generated counter arguments, but I still stand strong that if people are given the option between peace and war, they want peace.
Mm-hmm.
But because the war mentality has been so normalized in us, and because in ourselves, and this might be a stretch for some people, but it holds true for me, so I'm going to say it. If we're at war with ourselves, we're going to be okay with war on the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's hard to think about sometimes, because being at war with yourselves means, you're not your authentic self. You have moved into a space that you're unhappy, and you maybe can't figure out why. You maybe moved into a space of unhappiness, and it's so normalized in you that you think that unhappiness is happiness.
Yeah.
Or peace. I guess I don't want to say happiness, because happiness kind of, happiness comes with sadness, but like peace.
Yeah. And it's relative as well. What I mean by that is that, like, there was a point in my youth where I thought I was happy, but now that I am happy, again, I would kind of steer away from the word happy as well. I would just say more content, at peace, in a state of love. I realized that when I was younger, when I thought I was happy, I was just constantly perpetuating an illusion to myself all day, every day. And that illusion couldn't stand up scrutiny. If somebody questioned it, or if I questioned it myself, then I would get defensive and steer away from the questions, because I didn't want it to crumble. It was fragile. It was precarious. That state of being that I thought was happiness wasn't, because when I did analyze it, I realized it wasn't true happiness. It was just a state of distraction, a state of avoidance.
Yeah.
And I thought of something too when you were saying the normalization of war. I thought it was an interesting analogy. It is an agreed upon thing. Like you said, some people would like to do boxing or martial arts, and it is fighting in a sense, but it's an agreed upon thing, and that is their choice. And if both parties are coming into it because of their own will, then that's a completely moral thing. And on the level of governments and militaries and institutions, that is the way they see it. They're already at peace. They want peace too, but they want peace within themselves. They have the peace in the sense that they go to work and demand that their military will go over to another country and blow some people up. And then they come home and have a drink with their family and eat supper, and then they go to bed in what they consider peace. So they're still desiring peace as well, but they just don't care about the peace of others. So in the sense, it's like the powers that be are still agreeing upon it. So to them, they're like, yeah, it's an agreed upon thing. Like me in America and the guy I know in China, we're both agreeing to go to war. But the thing is that there are victims of your decision. You don't have the right to decide for someone else. So you are choosing to go to war, and it may be an agreed upon thing between you and another world leader, but there are a lot of victims. There's a lot of people that end up in the crosshairs because of your decision. So it's kind of like if you were to extend the analogy to like boxing or something like that, sure, it's completely moral and ethical for you and your friend to have a boxing match, but it wouldn't be if the gloves were sentient. If the gloves could feel pain, then the gloves should get a say whether or not they want to be hit repeatedly. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Or if the person jumped out of the ring and just started beating the crap out of the audience.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's a completely ethical and moral decision to agree to go to war if you are only affecting you and the other person who agrees upon it. But the idea that needs to be talked about here is the idea of personal choice. You don't get to make personal choices for other people.
Yeah. And I think an important part to put in here, and maybe people that are listening, I'll give a few resources so I don't go on another 2-hour tangent. But it has been shown that in times of war, or in times when the world economy is not working in alignment with the powers that be, and this is why I don't trust the powers that be with globalization, is because it's been shown, and you can look up the main guy that I've learned most of this from is named Noam Chomsky. He's awesome. The US, this is one I've studied the most, has bought military coups in other countries to fight different governments that doesn't serve the purposes of the quote unquote greater power. I witnessed this in Cambodia. If you look in Cambodian history, it's the Khmer Rouge who caused a civil war, basically a genocide. But when in Cambodia and reading a book on how the USA bought that military coup and paid for it, like I was reading it in an airport, and this guy came up to me and he was like, "It's really good that you're reading that." He just walked away. And I was astounded, because I was like in my mind at that point, I was like, is this true? Is this not true? This seems so far out there. But for someone to be like, "You white girl reading that, great." I was like, holy crap. And so it really opened my eyes to, like, for example, the Vietnam War, there was such a big rebellion for it because people realized like there is no reason for us to go there. Like why that was like a 10-year war. You know what I mean? So the reasons that the powers that be have given for wars and the lives that have been given up are not necessarily for the reasons that we think they're for.
Yeah.
That's the
Almost
trick
never.
part. Yeah.
Yeah. So there might be a little bit of it, but it's not their core reasoning.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? I'm never going to say fully this way or that way.
Yeah, exactly. It's always somewhere in between. You know, there's some people saying something on this end of the spectrum, and there's other people saying this thing on the other end of the spectrum. The truth is always somewhere in between. Yeah. Yeah. What was I going to say? I think I've lost it. No worries. I did want to move into this a little bit as well. I'd like to hear, I guess, what you think. I know we spoke about this a little bit before, but I'd like to go a little deeper and also see if we can put it out through the airwaves. I want to know what you think is going on, essentially, from all the research you've done, everything you've learned over the years. If you were to make a bet on what's true right now in the world about how things are run, and you know, given all the alternative theories and stuff like that, just I want to hear your most quote out there type of hypothesis on how the world is run.
Yes, but I'm going
at the risk of sounding completely, against the grain.
No problem. I'm going to normalize it a smidgen.
Okay, sure.
Just for understanding purposes, but I can only speak for North America.
Yeah.
And I think that we believe our governments are running the show. But if we look at the different corporations, especially in the States, but this does happen in Canada too, that fund the different political campaigns for certain reasons, that give basically bribes to these political candidates, I see corporations running North America. And I think that is one of the biggest resistances to change right now. If the corporations are the multi-billion-dollar companies, and like you can look up their meetings. I think they're called like the Bilderberg meetings. Bilderberg meetings. Like those are the people that are running the show. And those are the people that I think are messing with the corruption of our society. If we do think that our governments are running the show, and we're blaming, like, it's always like, oh, the liberals suck. Oh, the conservatives suck. Oh, the liberals suck. We continue to flip-flop. At the end of the day, it's the same corporations funding it, no matter who's the face of it. And I think that when we take a look at, like we were talking about, like the unethicalcy of capitalism is like, it's unethical in the sense that those corporations are there for themselves. And this is kind of a weird thought, but corporations, when you incorporate something, it is the actual company that becomes its own entity. And that entity can absorb risk and it can absorb shock, and the people behind it, no matter how many people, 1, 2, 3, 7, 100, can act in any way, ethical or unethical, it doesn't matter. And the company will absorb the risk. It'll absorb the shock, and it won't necessarily be their name slandered. It will be the company's name that's slandered,
Right.
if anything ever comes out of it. But it's those companies that are influencing the trade agreements. It's those companies that are influencing our policies. It's those companies that are influencing the decisions that are made in everyday governance. And so I think, like, we don't even necessarily need to call it a conspiracy, even though there are some people that think it is, because you can just Google like how much money is given by the corporations to,
Of course, yeah.
Like, lobbying is a total real thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, like, this was a big moral dilemma for me when the States was doing their Hillary versus Trump election. Trump is the first person that I could find that paid for his own campaign. Do I think he's a morally and ethically aligned person? Definitely not. But Hillary also, like, she has been funded since she stepped in there.
Right.
And you can see that too. Yeah. Like, it's not a secret. So to me, it was like, neither one was a good pick. But Hillary was the corporations and Trump was something else entirely. And it threw a wrench in the system. But do I necessarily think either one was a good choice? No. But if the corporations won the election, would there have even been a chance to make change?
Yeah.
Because now we're seeing, like, and this has been a well-argued back and forth with me in many different settings. Like, people are like, there's no positives to Trump. And I agree. But there is a positive in the sense that there's an opportunity for change, because it is, in a sense, the corporations running it through him, but it's the ones that he is invested in. And those are two, like, it's different ballparks of influence. And I think the influence, what I'm trying to get at, I don't want to get into like a Trump Hillary thing, I guess. My feelings about that are aside, but the influence that the corporations have on our governing system is what is bringing us to the conversations that we're having right now about reopen the economy. How many deaths are worth it? Like, how is this even a conversation? It's a conversation because the powers that be are smoke screening, in my opinion, corporations.
Yeah. I think that mentality comes from, it seems to be more characteristic of the conservative Republican type mentality, is that they're thinking in the long term. So they're willing to sacrifice people in the short term for perhaps the sake of humanity as a whole. And that might be how they, like, justify it to themselves, is that they're willing to make sacrifices that aren't their own lives, but others' lives. Because, like, yeah, we can let a couple million people die, but then in 100 years, we'll still have an economy. Whereas that's the kind of mentality that serves the long-term idea of humanity, but it doesn't serve the individual within the humanity right now. And I think both perspectives are necessary. We have to think about our long term, but we also have to value every single individual as well. And most people are either on one end of the spectrum. They're either about the long term, and yeah, we can sacrifice a few million people, or we're not letting anybody die. And then when you have that mentality, you're willing to make sacrifices in the moment that might affect your long term. So those are like the two ends of the spectrum that most people either are on one or the other. And again, truth is always in between.
Yeah. And, I would say even it's a neoliberal mindset as well. Like, I always, like, yeah, in the States, I see most Republicans being involved in the protests. And I do see that in conservative mindsets in Canada, but I also see it in the neoliberal mindsets in Canada. And so I think that we do really have to move away from the spectrum of politics, because at the end of the day, there is so much commonality that like no matter, like I've asked many people like, why do you identify liberal, why do you identify conservative, and the answers are so diversified that I don't think that we can move forward properly with our current spectrum,
Right.
because the identifications have been so skewed. um, and like the alignment that you identify with, and like you were saying before, like most of us have the same issues, we have the same commonalities, we just have different ways of dealing with them. But in all these conversations, I've realized that there is really not a lot of consistency
Mm,
in the reasoning why people pick. Like there could be the same reason that someone picks conservative is the same reason that I would lean more liberal.
right.
And I think that we need to remove those distinctions before we can actually move forward. Like I love the analogy of like it's the wings of the same bird. Like it
Mm,
definitely is. And of course, there's always outliers. There will always be outliers. But at the end of the day, the differences are very few and far in between. It's just the labels and identifications that make things seem so different.
mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%.
Mhm.
So, with all that said, I feel like we could basically say the same thing in a million different ways. So, I want to talk about basically where do we go from here?
Mhm.
What can we do in our everyday to start supporting this system that we want, this new one that actually takes care of everyone's basic needs and then more, because we can get to a point of abundance. It's not like we're just going to get to the point that we're all fed, clothed, and sheltered, and then we have nothing else, like no luxuries or anything like that. Of course, those things are still possible. But in order to get to that point, we might have to sacrifice some of those luxuries in the moment
Mhm.
in order to make these changes. So,
Yes.
what is the world we want to see really look like, and how can we start making some minor steps towards that?
Yes. So how can we start
Mm,
is, and I've seen this and I've been following this and I love this, is in my opinion, self-responsibility.
mm,
Self-responsibility is the biggest key factor. Like the luxury that we have to give up is the reliance on government and corporation to take care of us. It
mhm,
has proven time and time again that that's just not the feasible, reasonable, logical way to go about it. It has constantly left us in a state of lack or demise or sickness or illness, whatever it is, unsupported society that, how do I want to word this? I think self responsibility is key, because if we rely on other people to make the change for us, we're always going to end up disappointed.
mm,
If we
yeah.
take into our personal responsibility the way that we want to see the change happen, and this is the way every revolution has ever started. And the difference between the previous revolutions and this one, is that I think that this evolution, whether you call it the evolution of morality, the revolution of consciousness, the like whatever, it doesn't matter what you want to call it, it is moving into a space of I don't think we need the violence to be the catalyst anymore.
Mm,
I don't think we need to ask for permission. I think we can take into ourselves the change that we want to see. And I think we can take action on it. And I've seen this time and time again. Like, example, I have a friend who sees problems in the food bank. So she is actively herself trying to figure out how she can make those changes. Like, if someone needs to take the bus to the food bank and then bus home all of this food, she sees that as problematic. And so she, upon taking it upon herself to find a solution for that. There is the Bear Clan Patrol in Calgary, and I think in other parts of Canada. People listening could look into them. They're awesome, and they see a problem within society on in how people are treated, especially people in homeless situations, and they go around and they give out caring help in situations where they know that policing enforces, like there of course, like there's people like the dope team in Calgary and other great projects that will go help when the help is needed, but it's not to the extent that the Bear Clan Patrol saw. And so they went out and they just do a round every day. And there's other not just the Bear Clan Patrol, but I know there's other groups called a variety of different things that have just taken that sort of issue into their own hands and have decided, like, look, I want to help. And so even going around and doing the groundwork, like eventually all these different grassroots movements will create a bigger picture. But I think reliance on other people won't necessarily, I don't think I did the Bear Clan Patrol justice. Please look them up.
Okay. I feel like I might have heard of that. I noticed the other day when I was on a Facebook group that was about, I don't know, some sort of conscience raising or something like that. Somebody commented in one of the threads something about a bear group. It might have been called the Bear Clan. And when I looked at them, they were just basically like all about spreading positivity. Like, we can get through anything. We can do this. Like, they don't take any other, like they're so resolute about their intention is that, we can spread love and positivity to everyone. We can change this world through that.
Yeah. And it's an outreach program. And I think any outreach program, like grassroots movement, whatever it is right now, it's building a bigger picture. But it's when you're not looking for, like we were saying, like you can see only what you're looking for. And if you're not looking for that bigger picture, you're not going to see it. You're just going to see the issues. But the issues that you see are the most important part, because if you see an issue, you might be the only one seeing it. So acting on it is essential. And I think that's a huge shift. That will be a huge shift. We don't have to ask permission for the revolution anymore. We can just do it.
Yeah, I agree.
But we can't, sitting at home being like, I wish the government would do something about this, or I wish the corporations would do something about this, isn't going to make the change. It's the person taking responsibility. And this is where we might lose luxuries, because it's going to take time. Time is a luxury, especially if you're giving 8 hours a day, 5 days a week to something that you don't like. And then you need rest. Like, there needs to be rest time. But at the end of the day, if we don't put in that extra momentum to make the change happen, especially where we see the need, the change won't occur. So personal responsibility and openness to discussion, I think, are where we need to start. And then eventually moving into a place of learning that we can trust one another, because we know that most people are going out and doing their best to make the change that they want to see. Like, be the change, truly be the change.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a very simple concept, but it's the most true. Yeah. You definitely have to take personal responsibility. I think everyone needs that level of disillusionment. They need to realize that. And it's funny when we talk about this, we always kind of preface it with saying, yeah, like, I'm not saying I believe in this, but I don't believe the government is there to help us. It's like, it's almost like it's taboo to say it, to question our government, which is, that's the crazy part to me, because when has the government ever demonstrated that they actually are here for us? Like, if you really critically look at their behavior, there's no reason to believe that they are looking out for us. Everything that makes it seem like they are is always just some rose-colored glasses type thing, just like icing on the cake that they say, here, you can have this, but they give that to you so you won't question the thing that you should really be questioning. But when you truly question them and look deeply into all their behavior, you realize that the main goal isn't to actually take care of everyone. The main goal is to sustain growth and to keep the system going the way it is, because those that are benefiting from it do not want to let it go. So go ahead.
It does seem like especially in Canada, like, I have another perspective on this because my mom is from a communist country.
Oh, really?
And, yeah, she's from Poland. And so like there was like, when she moved here, like, this is it, like, capitalism is like the freedom. And like, people, like, having conversations with her has totally helped my mindset on this, because to me, I see the problems. I'm critical of it. And even if it's positive, I'm not saying I'm negatively critical of it, but I'm not just like, oh, this is great and I want it. You know what I mean? Or like, oh, this is great and I accept it. I always think like, yes, it could be better. Okay, I see the problems. Okay, I see the positives. Like, let's weigh this. But from someone that's from a communist country, they see like this is the shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
And so it is important to keep those perspectives in mind. Like, yeah, it is definitely a lot worse in other places. But does that mean that we shouldn't be critical of what's happening here?
It's the mentality of settling, really. You're just like, oh, yeah, it was way worse. Now it's better. So I'm not going to fuck with that. I'm just going to take it as it is. And even though there's a lot of shitty things still to it, it could be a lot worse. So I'm not even going to try to change it because I could end up in a way worse situation.
Yeah. And to her, this isn't worse. This is like a substantial upgrade.
Right. Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like she went from a place that toilet paper was a luxury to here, you know what I mean? Where people are currently hoarding toilet paper.
Yeah, could be a luxury again very soon, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. Yeah. So it's really hard to change the minds of those people like that.
Yeah. And you know what, do we even want to? Like I think that we could have like I've learned so much from those conversations that I have so much more gratitude. Like when I was like, I've seen the issues in society since I was a kid. Like I remember being 14, 15 years old and hearing my first few punk songs and thinking like, holy crap, someone else gets it. And so like from growing, like we were talking about, like the beliefs have like, you know, if I'm reinforcing my beliefs from 14, 15, just like really hammering in this music and this mentality and like, yeah, it does suck. And like, I'm like, I see it, I feel it. Yeah. It's in my heart. And then hearing the perspective of my mom saying like, look, in comparison to this, it's great. I'm like, okay, I need to give gratitude for that. I do.
Yeah, 100%.
You know? So there is a good balance.
So I was thinking about like the big change really and what would be really keeping us from doing that. And one thing that always comes to my mind is that, okay, let's say that the most extreme end of the conspiracy theory realm is true, and all the digging that I've done, because I look into everything. I don't know what I believe fully, but I have heard pretty much all the theories out there. I like to learn about these things to see what resonates with me, see what rings true. And one that is a reoccurring one that seems to have a lot of weight behind it is that there is some sort of cabal or deep state or Illuminati, whatever you want to call them. They might not even be just the people in the Bilderberg meetings. They might be people that nobody even knows. And that, like, there's no reason why I can't see that being a thing.
Yes.
So they might not even be in the public eye at all. Like those people in the Bilderberg meetings might talk to these people, but they don't even share their name. You know, they're higher up in a different sense. So, one part of that whole theory is that these people that are at the highest points, they are perpetuating this society of fear and consumption so they can basically have this slave race under them that allows them to basically keep their party going because they want to keep living the way they want to live. And that's like, comes from a more of a materialistic mindset where they just want more and more and more. And one of the things that they have been said to be a part of is like a global sex trafficking and pedophilic ring. And now, so if that's the case, if there's any truth to that whatsoever, that the people in power are somehow connected to this massive sex ring that involves children and, well, all kinds of people, that is something that if it came out to be true and accepted throughout the world, that society at large would never be able to accept that. And they would call for their heads on a stake or a pike or whatever you want to call it. Heads on a stick, really, immediately. Like if you found out that Hillary Clinton, yes, she is running some sort of pedophile ring, and immediately people are going to be like knocking at her door with pitchforks and being like, burn this bitch. So what I think it's that kind of mentality that keeps, in a sense, from these kinds of things, if they're true, from coming to the light, because the people who are doing that are going to do everything they can from getting exposed. So my approach, the way I see it, is that regardless of what people have done, I don't believe in just ending their life abruptly or treating them the way they may have treated others in order to punish them. Punitive measures, to me in general, don't seem to actually have the effect we want. So I think, well, I guess I would like to get your opinion on it. Like, say if it came out tomorrow and it was global news and it was accepted by everybody in the world that, yeah, all these people in power that are running things, they actually do have this pedophile ring, and they have these meetings and on secret islands where they have sex with children and abuse them and all kinds of such of abhorrent, horrible things. How do we handle those people? How can we encourage them to come out about the truth about what they've been doing? And I mean, like, because like, how are you going to tell somebody in that position to actually share the truth with everybody else?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yes. I call those people the 0.001%.
Yeah.
They're not even the 1%. They're the 0.001%.
Yeah.
Start this conversation by saying Jeff Epstein did not kill himself. And I think like the best conversation I've heard about this is people saying, look, the reason we have so much information on this right now is because we have allowed people to come forward without demonization. People that were a part of it have had and are having the opportunity to come forward and speak on it without being, and I don't want to say held accountable, because even them speaking on it holds them accountable. Like I couldn't even imagine having to be like, I did this shit.
Yeah, exactly.
I was part of it. But coming out and saying those kinds of things, we as a society, you're right. Like we can't, like if we're like going to hang every person that comes out, like no one's going to come out. But if we offer some kind of like opportunity for those people to amend and say like, look, whistleblowers, get out here. If you can come out and give us the information, then we will not demonize you. It's not to say that we will forgive you right away. It's not to say that we will hold you on a pedestal. We will not hang you for it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, at least you can promise them their life still.
Yes.
Because nobody's going to come out, like, even if you're a part of this, like you went to Yale and you got involved in a fraternity that brought you into a secret society. And in that secret society, you did blood sacrifices and they got you to sleep with hookers. So they had leverage over you. And then you took it one step further because you're like, I don't want to do your bidding no more. And they're like, well, we'll share that you slept with a hooker. Like, okay, I can deal with that. People sleep with hookers, no big deal. So they take the next step in those types of situations. We're like, we want you to get you somehow. They might get you maybe on some drug that impairs your judgment, or even make you unconscious to the point that you end up sleeping with a child, and then they film it or get some sort of proof. And then they hold that above you. And that's how they control the people in power, by having that leverage. It's all about leverage and control. And that's the whole Jeffrey Epstein story, is that he had all this information on all these higher ups. So to have, like, if you are one of those people that did all these horrible things, but you had an epiphany and you're like, I don't want to be a part of that. It's evil. And I realized I was evil and I want to change and I want to better myself. There is no real avenue for you to do that right now. You can't just go on YouTube, make a video and be like, listen, I was part of this pedophilic sex ring and I used to have sex with children. And yeah, I don't know what to tell you. I regret it, but I want to be better and I want to change. The world is going to crucify you immediately. There's going to be people knocking at your door and you're going to be killed. Like, honestly, somebody is going to take it upon themselves to show up at your house and kill you. Like, it's almost 100% like probable. So we need to create a space for people who have made these terrible mistakes to come forth. And I'm not saying we need to, like you said, we don't need to commend them for it, but we don't also need to punish them for it. Their own punishment is going to be their own mental state to deal with those things. Like the horrible things that I've considered myself to do are nowhere near the level at which these people might, but I still dealt with that guilt for so many years and that shame for so many years that was my own personal hell.
Mhm.
So, punitive measures isn't always necessary. If anything, they are sick. They're deeply sick, and they need our help, and they need our encouragement, and they need our love. Yeah. That sounds so foreign to some people, to help and love those that have committed such atrocities.
Yeah. And there is conversation right now around, a lot of the uncovering of this is because there are quote unquote less bad people that are coming forward, and they're the people that you're speaking about. They're the people that have had an epiphany, have had a realization, have been coerced into doing things, whether they're conscious or not, and then they are being blackmailed. And it's those people that there is being space held right now for them to come forward. But it isn't really like, and I know this is getting a little, sorry, conspiracy theory, but like it's in the conversations that I have heard, and in the conversations I've been in, the space is being held, and then it's, I want to say, unfortunately, the responsibility of those in the activist positions that have to mediate this with the general society and say, look, these whistleblowers are going to come forward. These people are going to come forward. And when they do, we have to realize that they're not the quote unquote, air quotes, bad guy. They're a less bad guy. Like, there is no real good or bad, but at the end of the day, they know what they did was immoral. It was bad. You know what I mean? But if we don't allow them that space, and if they don't have people like the activists standing in front of them saying, like, we have to give these people a chance to speak because we need the truth. I think the truth is more important than the demonization of. And that's going to be a difficult pill to swallow for some people. But there is the normalization right now that no, Jeff Epstein didn't kill himself. What does that mean? And what that means is so much more than what we're willing to accept, I think, at this point. But the more time goes on and the more things uncover, especially, I think, when victims of this start to come out and say, like, hey, this happened to me. I was rescued. This is what happened. This is my story. That's going to be a change maker. It's going to be huge. But until that happens, how can we prepare general society for the realization that, like, Jeff, whatever happened to Jeff Epstein, it was because of X, Y, and Z. And that integration, unfortunately, might be fortunately, unfortunately, neither of those is good, but like it might be the catalyst for the change that we need to make. Like, if you can show that something so horrific has been happening under the radar for so long, with proof, multiple victims, multiple people that were involved, people actually speaking out on it, then society will change, and it will change quickly, and it will change swiftly, because we'll realize that the 0.001%, like, the amount of money that's involved in that is, like, I can't even wrap my head around it, to be honest. What else do I want to say on this? I think that it is oddly becoming normalized knowledge. Like, I see people that I wouldn't even think would be interested or engaged with this kind of stuff spouting, like, Jeff Epstein didn't kill himself. What happened? What happened? What happened? And the deeper we get into this, and the more that we don't forget that it happened, and the more that we demand answers, like, there's so much going on in the world right now. We're so distracted from that. Like, we do still need to keep that in mind, that there was a cover up, and it was obvious. And
Yeah.
and we can't just, like, when these cover ups happen, it is general that society just lets it happen,
Yeah.
because we, again, are relying on the powers that be to deal with it. But if it's the powers that be that are influenced, no matter how many times the influence goes down, like, it's been shown time and time again in, for example, when something similar happens in the policing system, like, you can look up cases where there is a higher up saying, just leave it alone. Don't
Hmm.
touch it.
Yeah.
Just leave it alone. Don't touch it. And so, can we really rely on those systems to give us the truth?
Exactly. Yeah. And the answer is no.
No.
Yeah. And like I
And
said, the truth is more important than the demonization of these people. We have to allow that space to be, as uncomfortable as it may be. We have to have these conversations. We have to sit down with these people who have committed atrocities and say, tell me the truth of what happened, and give them that space to give us that information. But if they suspect that we're going to hang them at the end of it, then they're not going to tell us anything, and we're never going to get to the truth. If we continue to deny that these things are possible, that we could actually be run as a global system by a very small percentage of people who have done horrible things to maintain their system in general, then we're never going to progress as a society. We have to be able, I want to say we had to be able to forgive, and that could be years down the road for most people to be able to forgive these people. We at least have to be able to listen and accept the truth that they share
yeah,
without resorting to violence and just resorting to killing them just because of their involvement. Because ultimately, nobody at their heart wants to do harm. We all are a product of our circumstances. We all end up in situations because of what we were born into, essentially. We've all, I'm not saying we shouldn't be held accountable, but everything should be understood. Like, I've held myself accountable for the quote bad things that I've done, and I've done everything I could to mend those things. Like, if I ever lied or stole in the past or something like that, and I've remembered it and thought, oh, that was a terrible thing I did to that person, I would reach out and be like, listen, I'm not trying to get forgiveness from you here, but I want you to know where I was coming from. I did that terrible thing because I was afraid, and it wasn't anything to do with you. I wasn't trying to harm you. I just didn't know any better at the time. And I allowed myself to ignore the truth because I wanted to feel safe. And, by doing that, by sharing what I truly did, if they said, yeah, well, I hate you because of it, then that's okay. But to me, what matters most is that I get the truth out about who I was. And that's the only way for me to practice being a better person now, is to accept who I was and what I was capable of before. Because if I deny that aspect of myself, if I was just like, I just try to forget it entirely and move away from it, then it's bound to happen again, because I never really addressed the issue. So we need to give everybody that opportunity. All the people that done the most terrible things, created wars for oil or some sort of power or something like that, taking the lives of thousands just because it was better for the economy or something like that. We need to be able to sit down with those people and be like, tell us the truth. We're not going to kill you. Just let us know what went on, because we need to know these things. If we continue to deny the truth just because it's scary, and that kind of thing is just going to keep us going in the system that we're in. Nothing's ever going to change.
Yeah, and honestly, a tricky part is, like, if we continue to rely on the powers that be to give us those answers, we're not going to find them.
Exactly.
And so, how on earth are we going to find them without that? And that is a conversation that I think we need to open up.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a step forward. That's something we kind of established that we need to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have heard, like, the big conversation around this is, like, if the truth comes out, and this is true, not to say it is or it isn't, but, like, if the truth comes out, and, like, does it have to be something so horrific for us to actually make this change?
Yeah.
But then to even become aware of the 0.001 percenters is sometimes even like like it seems almost like mystical to some people, like that can't exist. How on earth would that exist?
Yeah.
But like to me, I have followed these kinds of things since I figured out how to work a computer, and I could dive into, like, I remember the first thing I ever saw was Zeitgeist. And then I went from there. And if you can take what you want from it and the truths that you want from it, but at the end of the day, that Jeff Epstein didn't kill himself. And what does that, like, what does that mean?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
And then people want to stop there, but like the going past that is so uncomfortable because you know where it's going.
Yeah.
But what does that mean for us as a society? Like, maybe the catalyst for change isn't violence, but it sure as hell can be anger. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. I think it's a necessary part of that process, because in a sense it is the grieving process. We're attached to a certain way of living, and we're attached to a certain idea about how the world works. So when we find out that it's nothing like we thought, and it's actually way worse, then we are going to be angry, and it's necessary for us. It's healthy for us to address and feel that anger. It just reminds me of I'm sure you're aware of the movie Network.
oh
No? Oh my God. You've probably heard the quote. You should definitely watch it. It's an excellent movie. It came out, I think, in the 70s or 80s. But basically, it was about this newscaster who basically became disillusioned with the way that things work. And then when he went live on TV one night, he just started spitting out the truth of the system. And one of the famous quotes is like, I don't know what to do about the inflation and the poverty and the rioting in the street. I don't know what to do about that. But first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. And it's so epic because it just puts that drive and that fire in people. Like, yes, we need to get mad first. Well, we don't need to, but if you do get mad, like if you got the level of equanimity where you can hear all these things and just be like, yes, that is true, we need to move past it, then sure. But most people who aren't aware of these subjects at all, the first time they hear that the world might be run by a group of Luciferian pedophiles or something like that, then they're going to get angry. They're going to realize that they've been effed in the A for their entire life, and they're going to get angry. And that's, you need to honor that. You need to act on that. Doesn't mean at no point should you condone violence, but what's the word I'm looking for? Passive protest or something like that. What am I looking for? But you know what I mean? Like, you don't violently try to change things. You just no longer be complicit in the system that you're a part of before.
Yeah.
So all those steps are necessary. You need to get mad, and then you need to understand. Then you need to learn more. Like, you get mad so you can start to understand that things aren't the way they were. And then when you calm down a little bit, you can look into the truth. And when you learn the truth things, that's when you can start to make change. But then you need to take the next step to loving and accepting everything and everyone. Because otherwise, we're just going to end up back in the same cycle starting. Because if we just take our anger and run with that, then we're going to be like, okay, well, we can't let these people do this anymore. And we're going to get mad at them. And then we're going to suppress them. And they're going to get punished and their children are going to get punished for generations of their of their doing. It's kind of the same thing with like the counterproductive way people go about like, you have people who are against racism or sexism, and the way they go about that is being angry at everybody who perpetuated that. Like, not even the individuals, but their lineage. There's people who are mad at every single white person because white people enslaved other races. There are people that are mad at every single male because males have suppressed women. So, but that's like, to grow up in a society where you are told right from the beginning that just because of who you are a terrible person because your parents or your grandparents did this, then they're going to feel alienated. They're going to feel that hatred. They're not going to feel that connectivity, and they're going to grow up to hate you, and it just repeats the cycle. So we need to treat everyone as an individual, not because of what they did before or what somebody they're connected to has done before.
Yeah. And I think that another point that's important to consider when you're talking about this is, like, I'm going to use, for example, like in Canada, we've basically committed a cultural genocide and a continual genocide towards Indigenous people. And there is a lot of people, like you were saying, that feel like, this isn't my responsibility. It's not my fault. But on the flip side, there is so much intergenerational trauma caused by what happened not that long ago. Like Canada's only been around for 500 years. The last residential school closed in 1996.
Wow.
So,
holy shit.
So it is still a current, it is still a current issue, even though we might not be noticing it. So the peoples whose parents and grandparents were in residential schools are feeling that intergenerational trauma. And it is because, 1996, I was alive. And so it is something that it's tricky, because is it particularly your or my fault? But is it your or my responsibility? And those are two different things.
Oh, 100%. Very different things. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not into the idea of placing blame or fault or guilt on anyone, but everybody should recognize the truth of the situation, and we should all take collective responsibility to better these situations. If you are in a position where you've benefited because of your race or your gender or anything like that, then you should use your benefit as a power to change things, so you no longer are the only ones benefiting. Coming from me, a white male, I'm doing what I can to speak about these subjects and kind of bring clarity to the people who don't understand it the way they might need to in order to progress. Because I can only speak from my own experience, but when I was younger, growing up in a town where I was parallel to a native reserve, I seen a lot of animosity between the natives and the whites. There was a lot of tension there, and I developed some racist ideologies because of that. Because of all the things we as a race have done to them, they have suffered generational trauma, and they were not educated on how to deal with it or how to progress or find their way out of it. So a lot of them would resort to substance abuse or something like that. And then me, being an ignorant white man, walking home from work one day and I see a native person passed out in a trail on the ground, I would just dismiss them when I was 14 years old and be like, Jesus, what a piece of shit. And that was my mentality. And I was just like, I wasn't so ignorant that I was like, they're all shitty. But my ignorance was yeah, a bunch of them just are dumb. They don't understand. And I had these terrible, ignorant type of ideas because I wasn't aware of the grand scheme of things. I wasn't educated about residential schools. I didn't even know what a residential school was until after I graduated high school. So I wasn't aware of how my lineage has created this situation. I was there ready to blame someone else and just dismiss them entirely because of their behavior, even though their behavior is a result of my ancestry's behavior and what I, by being connected to it in a sense, have helped create. So that's what I think we all need to do, is that if you're in a position of privilege, you need to use that privilege as a power to help and assist others in understanding these situations, so we can all grow from them and we can all benefit in the future from any system that we can put in place.
Yeah. And I think an important point of that is that we, even though there is still blatant racism, there is way more institutionalized or systemic racism ingrained in us. So it is that, it is the underlying racist tones, and it is the underlying systems that are already in place that prop up privilege or reduce privilege, depending on, but the systems that were in place, they were built by white people for white people. And I think that is an important part, because when you are privileged by this, when the system is a privilege to you, you don't necessarily even notice it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the tricky part, because that's when people are like, well, it's not my problem, or there's nothing I can do about it. And And then if their privilege is threatened, then they feel threatened. And then
Yeah.
the whole thing just goes out to lunch because they don't want any part of it because they would be losing something.
Yeah.
But systemically ingrained or systematically ingrained racism and sexism is still a prevalent issue. And like we
Mhm.
were talking about in the beginning, like we have so many generations alive right now that it is people that that was completely normal, and people that like that's not even on their radar, and it's a thing of the past. But there's still that whole gap of people in the middle, and there's still the systems that were in place. Like when I was mentioning that, you can incorporate something and it becomes its own entity, those entities have their own social systems.
Mhm.
And those systems are like, that's where things like the glass ceiling comes in. Like it's called a glass ceiling because other people that don't hit it won't see it.
Mm.
And so, if you're not hitting those ceilings, you might not even be noticing them. You'd be looking down thinking, well, shit, it's your fault that you can't get up here.
Yeah.
But you really can't see that barrier because it's invisible to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
100%.
that holds true in like the mindsets of when you're looking at an Indigenous person and you're having those judgments. Like that is not that's it's systemically ingrained. It's just taught to you by society.
Yeah.
And if we don't recognize, like props to you, you recognized it, right? You
Mhm.
saw it, you were like, this is problematic, this is something that society taught me, and so I'm going to change my mindset on it.
Yeah.
Like I was at a presentation on spiritual colonization, and there was that they were discussing like the drinking and drug problems that occur in those communities. And it is like they switched the narrative from my white privileged understanding to one of like, those are people that deserve our utmost respect because they are the ones coping, they are the
Mm.
ones getting through those issues. And it was so heavy. Like I can't even think about it without tearing up. It was so heavy.
Yeah.
And it was a very different perspective for me. And I think it was really important
Mhm.
because it's not something that would have even crossed my mind, but like those people do deserve the utmost respect because they are dealing with such deep trauma.
Yeah.
And it's the deep trauma that is still socially embedded in our society that we are responsible for dealing with. And that's the tricky part, because if we're responsible for dealing with it, but we think that it's not our fault,
Mm.
then are we going to deal with it?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's the kind of mentality we got to get away from, because most people do think like that. Like, if it's not my fault, it's not my responsibility. Well, that's not the
Mhm.
way it is. You are a human race. Everybody is your brother and sister. It's not like if my sister was in a jam and she got herself in that jam and she called me up and asked for help. I'm not going to be like, you got yourself in that jam. It's not my responsibility to help you. I'm gonna be like, you're my sister. I'm gonna help you. Of course. We
Mhm.
all need to have that kind of family type of mentality to everyone. Just because we have different skin colors and different genders and different races and different ideologies, that does not mean anything when it comes down to we are all humans. We are all conscious, sentient beings who deserve to feel good and to live our lives freely. So just because I wasn't the one who owned slaves, or I wasn't the one who opened a residential school, doesn't mean it's not my responsibility to try to change those things. I recognize my responsibility as part of the family of the human race, that some of my brothers and sisters of different color and of different ideologies were brutally genocided, like you said, for one, and a number of different horrible things have happened to them because of our situation. So I take it upon myself to choose to help, because I see it as my responsibility as part of the whole to try to better the whole. And in order to better the whole, we need to start where it's most terrible. And where it's most terrible is with the Indigenous communities and with the people who have suffered from sexism and racism and any other type of ism that has neglected people and segregated them in any way. It's all of our responsibility. It doesn't mean it's our fault. I don't have guilt. I don't feel like it's my fault that these things happened, but I certainly do recognize a responsibility within myself to help better the situation. Me shitting on myself and thinking, oh, I'm white, so I'm a piece of shit. My ancestors owned slaves, so that means I should hate myself. That doesn't help the situation. I need to recognize that I'm connected to that, but by bringing myself down because of it and making myself feel less takes away from my personal power, and it makes me less capable of actually making some change. But by understanding I do have power, I have personal power, and using whatever privilege I have to my benefit and to the benefit of others, I can start to practice something that actually makes changes on a grand scale because of my recognition of my responsibility to do so as a part of the human race, as a part of the sentient community, because I would extend this even beyond people and go into animals. The way we treat animals is a whole other can of worms. So, there's this whole idea that we only gotta help who we're directly at fault for damaging. That's not helpful at all. We all need to come together and help everyone the best way we can.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like an example of this, of something that is still ongoing from these issues is like I think there's a documentary on it called The Highway of Tears, and a few other documentaries on it that talk about the ongoing genocide of
Mhm.
Indigenous people. And it's because of the RCMP in Canada ignoring the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And
Mm.
that's still ongoing to this day.
Mhm.
So there is still a genocide that we do have to deal with, but it's one that's uncomfortable for some people, and it's one that's not even noticed by other people because it doesn't affect them at
Yeah,
all.
exactly.
And so when we're dealing with these issues, we want to think it's so far in the past, but like it truly wasn't. Like I think in like the 1800s was the end of slavery. In
Mhm.
the 1800s was the first suffrage movement, and
Mhm.
the first women to gain suffrage were white women. So like and it still is a process.
Yeah.
And considering that is uncomfortable for a lot of people,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to we still have to deal with these issues. Like, is there institutionalized, systemically ingrained racism in the RCMP in Canada? Yes. Do I get a lot of backlash when I say that publicly? Also, yes.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah.
So like I see the problem in the institutions, and this brings it back to like institutions versus the people that perpetuate it.
Mm.
Are there good cops? Are there bad cops? You know what
Mm.
I mean? Is
Exactly.
the system of policing inherently unhealthy, racist, sexist? Yes.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
but does that mean that every single person in it is fully racist and sexist? Of course not.
Yeah,
But like
exactly.
but also like they're perpetuating the system, and if you perpetuate a system, that's what you're choosing to put your power in.
Yeah.
That's why personal responsibility is so important. Like if you're choosing as a police officer to hold up a system that is so ingrained in racism and still promoting I don't want to say promoting, that's not the right word, but the genocide of missing and murdered Indigenous women, are you part of the problem?
Mm.
And though you're not personally
Yeah.
promoting the problem, you're promoting the system.
Yeah.
And that's the tricky part because, there's people that are like, all cops are bad. And like
Mm.
the whole system is bad.
Mm.
Definitely. And eventually, and this kind of ties it back to the beginning, like when you're in that system of power, eventually it ingrains itself into your personality.
Yeah.
And eventually, when your personality is so changed by your experiences, then you're going to have a completely different perception of how you're dealing with things. And it's not going to end up being an authentic truth for you. It's going to be what you were taught to do. It's also going to be a defense mechanism because if you're
Mhm.
perpetuating this unhealthy system, then you're also going to want to negate yourself from responsibility of the negative things that are coming from that system.
Yeah. As well, it comes back to like the attachment to the identity of it, or the fact that it's part of your livelihood. You're not going to want to jeopardize those things. If you're a cop and you see holes in the system and you can see how it might be systemically racist, but you're like, well, what am I going to do? I can't let go of my paycheck. I got to feed my kids. So, that fear makes you complicit. And what needs to happen is people need to address that and be like, are there ways I can change this? Can I change the system from within? Are there things I can speak up about it that might actually change it? Or are there other options for me? Could I get a new career? There's always things you can think about. There's always always room for change. But people are scared into these positions where it may not be their intention to be racist, but since they're part of a racist system, they are still perpetuating that system and supporting it. So, the intention is not there. So that's how they can kind of justify it to themselves. But if there are other options, it's kind of on you. It should be a part of your responsibility to take those other options. Like, you can think to yourself, yeah, I'm a cop and I'm part of this system, but do I need to be a cop? Or can I talk to my higher ups? Can I, the way I operate on a day-to-day basis, try to not perpetuate that system? Like when my partner wants to arrest someone who's Indigenous just because something minor that a white person wouldn't be arrested for, I can speak up and say, no, we're not going to arrest that person now, because if we put him in a different context, if we changed his skin color, would we arrest him? You can take those actions to try to change the system yourself. But in order to even begin to make those changes, you need to recognize that you are a part of it and take responsibility for it.
Yeah. And the examples that we're talking about can be portrayed in all of society. If you look at there is so much privilege in the dynamics. Doesn't even have to just be power dynamics, but they are. In all the dynamics within our society, if we want to dissect them all. But it is in those, even when we're saying okay, there's a white guy that's this isn't my fault, I didn't do anything. But at the end of the day, he has his privileges giving him, and her, white women too. We are ingrained in these systems of power that we're not even realizing. I've been told from other people, I don't put my last name on a resume because I don't want other people to know that I'm not white. It'll ruin my chances of getting a job. I want to kind of tie it back to an example that happened. Maybe it was previous to the domestic violence shelter and the homeless shelter. It was my job right before that. I had to quit for numerous reasons, but one of the big reasons, not the biggest one, this company had a whole bunch of issues, but one of the biggest reasons was an unethical treatment of a client, a patient. And I found in that moment that the power systems, that it's the same power systems that are shutting women down in the police force. It's the same power systems that are shutting people up in many different power dynamic situations. I found myself in the weirdest situation. So in that job, we had to restrain clients. So you would grab them in the way that they trained you, and you would hold them as they were doing whatever they were doing. And I had this one client in particular who was violent towards the male workers, not really towards the female workers. So I was very lucky in that aspect. So when I was restraining him, he was really beating the crap out of the male workers, and I was just holding on as hard as I could. And I was in one of those situations where it was a full day of us just grappling with this client. And we had to get him from a hospital back to his house. He had lived in a lockdown facility, and I want to say lockdown, but it wasn't very well maintained. This company had, again, so many issues. And on the ride, eventually we got him, and we had to call in backup. So there was 3 people holding him in the back of the van, and I was driving the van. And he had beaten these 3 guys up for the past 4 to 5 hours. So on the drive home, they started punching him. And it was almost surreal to me, because I, first of all, didn't really understand what was happening. And then I didn't, it took me a while to fully clue in. And so as they were hitting him, he was saying, you're not allowed to hit me, you're my worker, you're not allowed to hit me, you're my worker. And in my head, I was thinking, you signed up for this job. You knew you had to restrain people. You knew you're going to get hit a few times. And because today was a longer and tougher day, I didn't feel it gave them any right to do so. But from their perspective, this client had been beating the crap out of them for the past hours.
Right.
And so they had every right to do so.
Mm.
And that's a power dynamic situation that I found problematic. And what really threw me off in that moment, what he was saying, like, I'm going to tell on you guys are going to get in trouble. And they were like, none of us are going to say anything. And he looked at me and I saw him in the rearview mirror and he said, Julia's going to say something. And they were like, no, she's not. Like, they didn't even give me a chance to speak. They were just like, she's not going to say anything. So when I got called into the office, it was the client and my boss, who was a problematic person in himself, were saying like I was the last one to be interviewed. And they said, Julia, like, this client says that he was beat up on the drive home. All the other workers said he wasn't. What happened? And it was in that moment that I was like, this is one of those things that it's like you join the boys club or you don't. And I didn't. I told the truth. Everyone at work hated me. I was ostracized for the rest of the time I worked there. I was given the crappiest jobs. No one wanted to talk to me. No one would wanted to help me. No one wanted to team up with me because I was a snitch. And it was a moment of realization for me, because I know that in those moments, like in the police force, in whatever power dynamic governing system, if there's a moment where the boys club has to be a boys club and you're not in it, you're ostracized.
Oh yeah,
100%. You're out of there. And so it's the privilege of having like a healthy mental health capacity in those moments to not be in the situation where the client needs assistance. And that assistance, maybe he is breaking out in violence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he deserves violence.
Exactly.
And so you could use this example to show multiple different components of like, maybe there are police officers that have had negative experiences with this group, etc. And they've moved that into a space of allowing them to approve their own, the ways that they're reacting, even though the ways that they're reacting aren't necessarily morally or ethically aligned with anything that is true.
They found ways to justify it to themselves.
Yeah. And so that the justifications, like I understand, I see, but at the end of the day, I know what's morally and ethically aligned. And I was very lucky in that situation that I wasn't the one having the crap beaten out of me. But if that's the job you sign up for, then that's unfortunately the job you sign up for.
Knowing that. And obviously it's going to be part of the job. They're going to tell you, don't beat up the patients or the clients, clearly that's part of the system. So yeah, those people were definitely acting out of turn. They weren't acting in accordance with what they agreed to. So,
and that's just a small example of what happens on a larger scale within our policing system.
Exactly. Yeah. All these systems have a lot of terrible flaws. I actually have to start to wind this down because I have to be done in about 5 minutes. I didn't realize time got so ahead of me. So I knew this was going to be a two-parter because I know we could talk for hours and hours. So I just want to, I guess, bring it to like a more positive close. We discussed a lot today. It was very needed to get out there. I'm really glad. But you and I often talk about the world we want to see and the world that we know is possible and that you and I individually work towards. So I just want you to kind of like go into your mind, go into like fantasy land and paint a picture for me of where you can see us being in a few years' time when we work out all the kinks of the system. What's possible for us? How could our society actually run? Give me a basic type of description of that.
Okay, so I think after we've dealt with the resource-based economy, the basic human needs, and we don't have to work for that anymore, we can move into a space of creativity. I love that. I think that's something that is so lost in our society. I myself had to refine my creativity, like when I was able to start the community groups and say, like, let's have these conversations and actually have, like, know that, okay, if I'm doing this without thinking like this is what I'm going to get paid for, like how am I going to make money doing this, and I'm just doing this from the heart, my creativity was able to shine and I actually felt fulfilled. And I think the fulfillment is what's missing in our society, and I think the fulfillment is what's going to fix our society. If we can find fulfillment in everyday life because we're not struggling to meet our basic needs, that's going to change the game for us. I think some people yeah, some people take time for their creativity and I love it. And I think other people have fully lost their creativity. And
Mhm.
I definitely was one of those people. And I feel like creativity is where we're going to grow. But until we get there, we have to learn to get along and we have to learn to share. And
Mhm.
that it seems so basic, but at the end of the day, like greed and corruption and just competitiveness has taken over society. But once we get there, the expression of creativity is what's going to propel us forward. Like if we didn't have to work for basic needs, we would be so much farther forward as a society because
Mhm.
creativity would give us so many different solutions, not even to problems, but just to ways we want to enhance.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. Very, very astute observation. Yeah. Mhm. Well, I feel like that's a great ender. I don't know if you want to say anything as your final words, anything that comes to your mind that you wanted to discuss that we never got a chance to. We got a few
Mm.
minutes.
My final words are Jeff Epstein didn't kill himself.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me give you this time now to plug yourself. You got a lot of things that you can share.
Mhm.
Where can people find you? What do you do? What is your work? And what are your websites, your socials, all that good stuff?
Mm. Your Mind's Way,
Hmm.
yourmindsway.com, Your Mind's Way on Facebook, Your Mind's Way on Instagram,
Okay.
Consciousness Calgary,
Hmm.
Consciousness Calgary on Facebook, Consciousness Calgary on Instagram, consciousyyc.com.
Okay.
All of those things will have the events. And the community is a group on Meetup. It's a group on Facebook. And yyccommunity.com is a work in progress. It is up, but it will soon to be beautiful.
Mm,
Um, More to come. But
cool. That stuff that you've been sending me, like the blogging and the essay type form of writing you've been doing, where are you going to be publishing that?
that is going to be a blog on the community.
Okay. Is it just
I
called The Community?
Yeah, it's called The Community.
Okay.
And so yeah, you can find it on Instagram, you can find it on Facebook, you can find it on Meetup, and eventually you will be able to find it on blog format
Right on.
whenever I take my essays and make them into digestible blogs.
Yeah. Cool.
But and there
Excellent.
will coming soon, hopefully soon, 2021 will be the People's Revolution podcast,
Ooh.
which I am super excited about. And I have a great lineup of speakers thus far. I just have so much more on my plate right now. I want to make sure I'm giving it 100%. And right now I'm finishing a few modules and workshops and different things that I want to roll out this year. And so it is
Right
next on
on.
my plate.
Excellent. All good stuff.
Yes.
Well, all right. Thank you so much. That was absolutely riveting.
Oh, we'll do it again for
Yeah,
sure.
definitely. Let's get together again in the next week or so and
Mhm.
have part two because I feel like we just scratched the surface.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So yeah. We'll speak soon. Thank you for coming on to the Further Liberation podcast. It's been a pleasure.
It was a pleasure.
And until next time.